Good evening. And tonight, the dark side of Bayer's cough syrup begins in a Bayer laboratory in Elberfeld, Germany, in 1898, where pale winter light falls through tall factory windows. Acetyl anhydride hangs sharp in the cold air. Amber bottles shine on a mahogany shelf, and the glass panes are cold enough to bloom white with your breath. Welcome back if you have been here before, and a quiet hello if this is your first night here. Tell me where you are and what time it is for you. I am here in a still late hour, and I read every comment. If you enjoy these slow journeys, please like the video and subscribe, so I can keep making them. Have you ever picked up an ordinary bottle and wondered how something so small could carry such calm confidence? Tonight you follow one substance, diacetylmorphine, from a neat German shelf across 125 years and every continent on Earth. You will meet Heinrich the marketing man in his polished shoes, watch Dr. Well-Meaning smooth his magnificent mustache, and stand beside officials who believe paperwork can settle chemistry. Before the night is over, you will taste a spoon of winter cough syrup, wait on a damp Marseille dock near stacked crates and wet rope, and learn the strange rules that decide who may prescribe and who must suddenly pretend not to notice. Somewhere along the way, a small warning will arrive in the letters column of a Boston medical journal and be set aside with perfect professional calm, but that comes later. For now, everything still fits neatly on a shelf. The room smells of coal heat, damp wool, ink, and the sour bite of acetyl anhydride catching lightly at the nose. A chemist in shirt sleeves has already placed a small amber bottle in your hand, and its clean white label reads with serene certainty, heroin, non-addictive substitute for morphine. The bottle is not dramatic. It is almost disappointingly tidy. Its shoulders are round and smooth. Its glass is a little warm where another hand has just held it. The label sits straight, trimmed square with one tiny bubble where the paste dried too quickly. Nothing in the room suggests scandal. Everything suggests order. There are scales with brass weights in velvet-lined boxes. There are folded papers for powders, corks in a dish, and a row of rinse stirring rods drying on a cloth. Someone has left a pencil shaved to a careful point beside a ledger. Outside, Elberfeld is gray with winter. Inside, Bayer prefers clarity. The factory windows are tall, and their panes divide the weak daylight into long, pale bars. Coal smoke drifts beyond them in a soft brown veil. A clerk somewhere in the building closes a drawer with the gentle firmness of a man who likes numbered things. No one here feels reckless. That is the first important detail. They feel modern. They feel useful, in the calm way of late 19th century laboratories, that the future is mostly a matter of good notes and clean glass. Heinrich Dresser is close by, though not posing for history. He is busy with papers. He is Bayer's pharmacologist, and he is preparing to present results that seem extremely promising. On his desk lie drafts, observations, and the sort of firm sentences men write when they have met success before lunch. The room around him hums with that quiet, bright confidence that comes before anyone has had time to be embarrassed. Felix Hoffmann has passed through this story already, though his name will grow larger later. He is the chemist who made the substance. In the same busy week that he helped perfect aspirin, he also prepared diacetylmorphine in Bayer's laboratories. It did not arrive wrapped in thunder. It arrived by ordinary chemical steps, neat enough to fit in a notebook margin. That is often how the past behaves. The enormous thing enters wearing ordinary shoes. A flask is warmed. A powder is stirred. A liquid is added with care. Someone writes down a yield, wipes a rim, and reaches for the next task before the coffee is cold. The sharp smell in the air comes from that work. Acetyl anhydride has a sour, biting edge. It is the smell of a tiny change with very large consequences. Morphine, altered by acetylation, becomes diacetylmorphine. Two small acetyl groups are attached, and the molecule leaves the bench with a new name waiting in the wings. Chemistry can be quietly mischievous in this way. It makes a tiny edit and hands the century a different mood. Nothing about the new substance looks wild. It is only a refinement, a variation, a tidy answer to a tidy problem. The bench remains clean and the men in the room remain respectably dressed. To understand why this little bottle seems helpful, it helps to sit for a moment with morphine. Morphine had been in many ways a marvel. Doctors prized it because it worked. It eased pain, it quieted coughs, it calmed distress. It fit conveniently into the black leather bags of physicians who wanted something reliable and swift. Reliability can be very charming. It can also be troublesome. As the century moved along, many doctors began to notice that morphine sometimes stayed in a person's life longer than expected. A patient might start with comfort and end with dependence. The words were not yet settled, but the pattern was becoming hard to miss. There was even a name for it. People spoke of morphinism with grave professional neatness. The term sounds like something that should wear spectacles and sit by a fern. It was, in fact, a very real medical concern. Doctors had not set out to cause it, and many of them earnestly wished to prevent it. So the search for substitutes made perfect sense. A less habit-forming medicine would be welcome. This was not some comic scene of men in frock coats twirling mustaches over bubbling flasks. It was a genuine medical hope. The problem on the table was real, and the wish to solve it was sincere. There was another reason the bottle in your hand looked useful. The cough. Tuberculosis was everywhere enough to shape daily life. It was in family worries, quiet parlors, boarding houses, and the long routines of sanatorium care. Even where no diagnosis was spoken aloud, the cough itself could dominate a room. A long cough changes the shape of the night. It robs sleep first. It keeps the patient awake. Then the next bed, then the whole household listening between spoons and blankets. It leaves throats raw and tempers worn thin. A medicine that could quiet such coughing seemed almost kind before anyone reached for bigger words. So diacetylmorphine entered medicine carrying two attractive promises. It might calm a severe cough, and it might replace morphine. That double promise gave it an especially bright polish. It could solve yesterday's problem and tonight's discomfort at the same time. Pharmaceutical optimism adores a two-for-one arrangement. In Elberfeld, optimism was practically part of the furniture. Bayer had grown from dyes into medicines. German chemical industry at the end of the 19th century had a reputation for seriousness that traveled well. Precision itself had become a kind of sales tool. Clean benches, exact weights, and proper records suggested virtue as much as accuracy. Even the bottles help with the performance. Amber glass looks respectable. It also serves a practical purpose, since dark glass protects some contents from light. Yet usefulness and theater often share a coat rack. A row of matching amber bottles on polished wood can make almost any liquid seem trustworthy. The mahogany shelf does its share as well. It is not grand, just steady. Its surface has been rubbed smooth by sleeves, cloths, and the small industry of ordinary days. One corner holds a faint ring left by a damp bottle bottom. A neat shelf is a very persuasive witness. The labels are trimmed by hand. The paste is brushed on with patient strokes. Each finished bottle joins the row with the modest pride of a schoolchild standing straight for inspection. Order becomes part of the cure long before anyone swallows a dose. The eye is soothed before the chest is. Late Victorian medicine loved this mixture of science and display. It also lived among a remarkable number of patent remedies. Newspapers carried notices for tonics that promised appetite, vigor, rosy cheeks, calm nerves, cheerful digestion, and a general return of one's better self. Some bottles contained alcohol, some contained opiates, some contained mostly optimism with decorative typography. Confidence was never in short supply. Evidence was more shy. There were soothing syrups for babies, drops for nerves, cordials for women, restorers for tired businessmen, and powders that claimed to settle almost anything except doubt. No one advertised uncertainty. No label ever murmured, perhaps. Respectability in this world was partly a matter of tone. If a bottle sounded sure, it sold. This is where Bayer wanted to seem different. Not less confident, but more scientific. It did not want to look like the loud cousin at the fair selling bottled moonlight. It wanted to look like the sober relative with clean cuffs and laboratory backing. The promise would be just as large, but the paper would be better quality. That is why the name mattered so much. A name can make a compound sit up straighter. They chose heroin, and the word itself tells a small, revealing story. It came from heroisch, the German word for heroic. The name was meant to suggest strength, vigor, and a certain sturdy feeling reported in early tests. It is one of those names that sounds more revealing the longer you stare at it. Not subtle, not cautious, very pleased with itself. One can almost hear the room agreeing that this new medicine sounds brisk and modern. Heroin, a clean little word. It sits on the label as confidently as a well-knotted tie. Bayer did not simply describe the substance, it branded and trademarked the name. That was a very modern move. The company was not just selling chemistry, it was selling a packaged identity, a reliable house style, and the reassuring feeling that someone organized had already thought this through. A branded drug travels differently than a loose powder with a long Latin name. It fits catalogs. It can appear in advertisements, physician circulars, pharmacy drawers, and export crates without losing its neat outline. It can be asked for by name. That alone gives it a strange power. Soon enough, the fictional spirit of Heinrich the marketing man drifts into view. He is not a single historical person. He is every polished representative who arrives with samples, printed claims, and an expression of excellent sleep. His collar is sharp, his shoes are shining, his faith in controlled outcomes is so sincere that it becomes almost touching. He walks through time in perfect grooming. He is always certain the new solution is fully under control. Here in 1898, he is especially happy. He has fresh pamphlets in his case and strong copy in his pocket. The future, as far as he can tell, is merely waiting to be properly informed. The launch had the atmosphere of a Victorian pharmaceutical influencer campaign. There were glossy pamphlets, physician endorsements, a catchy name, and absolutely no comment section. This last feature mattered more than anyone realized. Doubts had to travel slowly by letter, journal, and awkward conversation. Confidence, meanwhile, could travel by mail. The pamphlets praised heroin as a cough remedy and a substitute for morphine. They spoke in the firm, steady tones that make uncertainty feel almost impolite. Doctors were shown dosages and indications. Pharmacists were given product forms and ordering information. Everyone was invited to imagine that the troublesome old era had at last been improved upon. And to be fair, this kind of improvement had happened before. Modern medicine really had produced useful wonders. That made the confidence feel earned. People in laboratories and clinics had good reasons to trust method, measurement, and new synthesis. Not every bright bottle led into a thicket. Some bright bottles really did help. A late 19th century doctor lived among new tools and fresh authority. He had thermometers, microscopes, and a growing belief in laboratory truth. He also had patients who wanted relief tonight, not after a decade of cautious follow-up. A medicine that seemed to work after a few visits could begin winning loyalty very quickly. Long shadows need time to stretch, which brings in Dr. Well-Meaning, who always arrives carrying the newest answer to the previous answer. His mustache remains magnificent through every decade. In 1898 he is especially content. He has seen the problem of morphine dependence. He has heard the long coughs in the night. Now a respectable German company offers a modern alternative in attractive packaging. He reads the literature. He nods. He prescribes. He does not feel reckless because he is following the best guidance available to him. He is not a fool. He is exactly the kind of careful physician a family might trust with their medicine cupboard tea. That is part of what makes this history so quietly strange. The trouble begins inside ordinary trust. A doctor with clean hands and decent intentions writes a prescription. A pharmacist folds a label around a bottle. A patient takes a measured dose from a spoon. History often slips into the house by way of proper procedure. It helps to picture how such a dose might arrive. The pharmacy is warm with dust, soap, and faint peppermint. Glass jars stand behind the counter with their names painted in gold. A scale rests under a bell jar. The pharmacist moves with practiced economy, tying parcels, counting tablets, and reaching for bottles without needing to look twice. Heroin could appear in several forms. It might be sold as a syrup, a lozenge, a powder, or a tablet. The exact form mattered less, at first, than the mood around it. It was respectable stock. It sat among the other approved aids of ordinary illness. No one whispered when it was ordered. If it came as a cough syrup, it might be sweetened into something almost companionable. Sugar has always been useful diplomatic staff for medicine. A spoonful could carry a faint medicinal bitterness under the syrup, followed by the dull comfort of sweetness. It would not taste sinister. It would taste like a promise in liquid form. Even that taste belongs to the story. So does the bottle's little cork squeak. So does the paper wrapper around a purchase on a wet afternoon. So does the small change returned across the counter. Great historical changes rely heavily on people doing tiny, boring things with complete normality. Back in Elberfeld, Dresser is helping shape the language that will escort this compound into the world. His findings appear favorable. He reports that heroin seems useful as a cough sedative. He presents it as a substitute for morphine. In the short view available at the time, the picture looks encouraging enough to print. Short views are very persuasive. They fit nicely on a page. A few observations, a few cases, a few hopeful results, and the mind begins to tidy the future into agreement. Medicine has always needed time, and time has always been in short supply where suffering is involved. The chemists and pharmacologists did not know what later generations would map in detail. They did not know about receptors. They did not speak in the language of neurotransmitters, blood-brain barriers, and pharmacokinetics over lunch and coffee. They spoke in symptoms, impressions, dosages, and observed effects. A medicine that quieted coughs and seemed manageable could earn trust long before its deeper pattern was clear. Diacetylmorphine enters the body somewhat differently from morphine, and that difference mattered more than the room understood. Yet in 1898 it looked like a refined improvement. Past medicine often meets the future in this exact pose. It has one hand on something real and the other on something misunderstood. The posture looks very dignified from a distance. Felix Hoffmann, for his part, is not standing under a spotlight. He is one chemist among many tasks. It is one of history's odd little jokes that the same week brought him close to aspirin and heroin. One compound would become the world's familiar tablet in kitchen drawers and travel tins. The other would take a darker, more complicated route through medicine, law, smuggling, panic, suffering, treatment, and recovery. If his ghost later wanders through this story in silence, it earns the right honestly. For now, though, he is simply alive and working. He would have known yields, reagents, and laboratory routine better than prophecy. He would have known how long a flask should be warmed, how stubborn a residue could be, and how quickly the day disappeared into small procedures. Catastrophe had not yet introduced itself. That is another useful thing to remember. The people at the beginning rarely feel like the beginning. They are in the middle of regular business. Someone is waiting for fresh labels. Someone is asking about shipments. Someone wants the latest figures copied neatly before supper. The whole scene is cushioned by ordinary textures. Wool coats dry near a stove. Cork crumbs gather on the table. An assistant rinses a funnel and hangs it to drain. Another worker rubs his cold hands together before picking up a pen. The world is changing while people fuss over ink stains and missing twine. That is why the little white label matters so much. It is both absurdly simple and very consequential. Heroin, non-addictive substitute for morphine. The sentence manages to be confident, helpful, and wonderfully wrong all at once. It is the sort of sentence that could only be written before the years had spoken back. Still, nobody in the room thinks they are lying. That would make the story easier than it really is. They think they are naming a modern cure. The words come from faith in data, faith in industry, and faith in the pleasant habit of assuming tomorrow will confirm what today suggests. Human beings are remarkably fond of this habit. A printed claim also has a special power. Once ink dries, it feels older than it is. A statement in a pamphlet acquires a code of authority simply by being typeset. Add a reputable company name and a respectable bottle, and even a bold promise begins to feel almost furniture-like. It seems less like an opinion and more like part of the room. Bayer understood this very well. Its medicine was not just manufactured, it was staged. Samples moved outward to physicians, catalogs named the product, the trademark fixed the word in place. Heroin became something one could stock, recommend, and reorder. Soon it would appear in respectable pharmacies well beyond Germany. That was part of Bayer's success. The company was already international in ambition, and the drug world was learning to move along the lines of commerce with impressive speed. Crates, invoices, tariffs, circulars, and translated instructions all helped a bottle travel farther than any chemist at the bench. When a medicine begins in a famous laboratory, it inherits a useful glow. People trust the shelf it came from. That glow matters tonight because the story ahead is not about a substance born in shadows. It is about a substance born in fluorescent confidence. Though the lighting in 1898 is gas and winter sun, the shadows come later, but the shelf comes first. The shelf really is lovely in its way. Dark wood, amber glass, white labels. If you stood there long enough, you might begin to feel the same calm everyone else feels. Here is order. Here is method. Here is medicine lined up in obedient rows. Even the language of the time leans toward reassurance. One does not sell a frightening remedy. One sells relief, convenience, safety, modernity, and a smoother path through the night. To promise anything less would seem timid. The age had no patience for timid bottle labels. There is something almost cozy about the confidence. That may sound odd, but it is true. A household remedy, a doctor's visit, a cough eased enough for sleep, a product endorsed by serious men in good jackets. The whole arrangement fits so comfortably into ordinary life that warning signs look at first like impolite guests. And yet the warning signs were already possible. They simply had not accumulated enough social weight. Medicine often notices trouble in fragments before it recognizes it in chorus. One doctor sees a difficulty, another sees an exception, a third sees a patient who is surely just unusual. It takes time for pattern to outvote optimism. For now, optimism is winning easily. It has better paper, cleaner offices, and a stronger distribution network. It also has Heinrich the marketing man, who can turn any modest clinical note into a handsome assurance before the ink is dry. He means well in the most dangerous administrative way. He mistakes organized information for settled reality. He would never describe himself as selling hope, of course. He is selling science. His circulars would emphasize proper dosage and desirable effects. It would likely mention the absence of troublesome habits with the easy certainty of people standing near the start of an observation. The future would be invited to agree later. Doctors were hardly passive recipients of such claims. Many were eager for good tools. The late 19th century was a period when medicine really was becoming more systematic in important ways. Bacteriology, laboratory methods, and industrial production gave physicians fresh reasons to trust professional progress. Hope had academic backing now, so when heroin was presented as a useful modern drug, the claim landed on receptive ground. It matched the mood of the age. The age liked solutions with labels. It liked problems that looked newly manageable. It liked the thought that one could improve upon nature, improve upon older medicine, and improve upon the previous generation's mistakes in one smooth movement. That is why the name heroin still carries a strange chill. It sounded like a cure because it was meant to. The word had lift in it. It was brisk, memorable, and clear enough to print large. It had none of the fussy heaviness of longer chemical names. A pharmacist could say it once and a customer would likely remember it. You can almost hear it crossing languages. A modern product, a smart product, a product with laboratory manners. It is easy, from the far end of the story, to imagine that everyone should have known better. History rarely grants that comfort honestly. Most people only know what their own hour has taught them, and 1898 had taught this room to trust a neat result. Trust can be very hard to distinguish from wisdom while it is still warm. The bottle in your hand feels only slightly heavy. Its glass catches the pale light from the window. The white label glows softly against the amber. Somewhere behind you a chair scrapes, and a page is turned. Dresser will send his findings out into the world of journals, physicians, and product literature. Bayer will package the promise. Pharmacies will stock it. Doctors will prescribe it. Households will learn its name. The medicine cabinet will make room, because that is what cabinets do for things that arrive respectably. And every step will feel ordinary. That is the quiet part we're staying with. No black market exists here yet. No senator is holding a press conference. No border official is peering at a crate with narrowed eyes. There is only a laboratory, a company, a real medical need, and a product that seems to answer it elegantly. For a little while, the answer appears to work exactly as hoped. That makes the later trouble more, not less, understandable. A good cough suppressant earns gratitude very quickly. A substitute for a troublesome older drug earns professional attention even faster. Gratitude and attention together are excellent launch conditions. One can imagine the first doctors writing back with approval. Their patients coughed less. Their shelves had something new. One can imagine the first pharmacists ordering more. A named product from Bayer had its own tidy appeal. One can imagine the first patient sleeping through a night that had lately been broken into raw, tiring pieces. This is how a century-long journey begins, not with a shout, with relief. The room in Elberfeld remains calm enough to hear tiny sounds. Glass taps wood, paper rustles, someone clears his throat in the next room. The bottle is still in your hand. Its promise is still whole. The world beyond the factory windows is large. and none of the men inside can yet imagine how far this label will travel. Later, the label will meet law, smuggling routes, city crises, treatment wards, and recovery meetings that smell faintly of coffee and wet coats. Later, the word will lose its innocence and keep traveling anyway. But tonight, we are still at the moment when it sounds helpful. That is the moment people often skip. They hurry to the scandal and miss the shelf. They jump to the dark street and miss the laboratory. Yet the shelf explains the street far better than the street explains the shelf. So stay here a little longer in the pale winter light. The cold glass of the window still holds the mark of breath. Heinrich Dresser straightens a paper. Felix Hoffmann moves on to the next task. Heinrich, the marketing man, somewhere in the spirit world of salesmanship, is already smiling into his sample case. And you stand with a bottle that believes its own label. That is how strange and dim the past could be. In the years just ahead, that confidence will spread through clinics, catalogs, and respectable pharmacies with remarkable ease. The name will be repeated by serious people in serious rooms. For now, though, it is only a word that sounded like a cure, printed squarely on white paper, drying in a quiet German laboratory, while the century waits outside in the cold. In Elberfeld, the windows are tall, and the winter light is thin enough to count dust in. The room smells of cold glass, coal heat, and the sharp tang of acetyl anhydride. On a mahogany shelf, amber bottles stand in a row, waiting with perfect patience. A chemist has made diacetyl morphine only days after helping make aspirin behave itself. The first bottles look neat and harmless, which is often how trouble likes to dress. Nobody in the room can see the next century leaning quietly against the door. The name chosen for it is heroin. It sounds brisk and modern, and just a little proud. It lands on the ear like a polished cuff button. Heinrich, the marketing man, is already pleased with everything. He smooths his sleeves, admires the labels, and speaks warmly of doctors everywhere. He has the steady glow of a man who has never once met an unintended consequence. The labels are handsome. The print is clear. The little bottles catch the pale light and look as proper as anything on a respectable German shelf. Soon there are pamphlets. Soon there are claims. Soon there is that very late Victorian belief that if a thing is wrapped in clean paper, it must be wise. Bayer presents the new medicine as a gift to modern life. It is offered for coughs, chest pain, and restless nights. It is also offered as a gentler step away from morphine. The pitch is smooth enough to glide across a marble counter. Heroin, the company says, soothes without the old traps. It is a Victorian pharmaceutical influencer campaign with glossy endorsements and no comment section at all. The listener leaves the lab and steps into a pharmacy several streets away. Brass scales gleam beneath gaslight. A bell gives one modest ring as the door opens. Here the medicine is not hidden. It sits near other reputable comforts. There are soap cakes, hair tonics, tooth powders, and cough drops in tidy glass jars. The pharmacist wears a dark coat and keeps his cuffs very clean. He moves with the calm pride of a man who trusts labels. When he reaches for the Bayer bottle, his hand does not hesitate. A mother asks for help with a night cough. An older clerk wants something for a chest that will not settle. A man in a wool scarf asks for relief that will let him sleep before dawn. The answers are ready. A spoonful, a few tablets, a corked bottle wrapped in paper and tied with string. No one whispers. No one glances over a shoulder. Heroin is sold over the counter like a sober household tool. In America, it appears in catalogs that promise order by post and progress by rail. A family can sit at the kitchen table and shop for a stove, a Bible stand, and a medicine. The page turns with the same dry rustle for all three. Sears listings fold the product into daily life with remarkable calm. The type is small, the promises are large, the paper smells faintly of ink and dust and winter stove smoke. A buyer in Kansas or Ohio can mail away for remedies with the same quiet hope used for curtain hooks. Inside waits a bottle with a printed label and complete confidence. There are kits as well. Some include tablets, some include a neat little measure and printed directions in compact type. The parts are arranged with almost touching neatness. A small vial rests beside folded instructions. The whole thing feels less like vice than a sewing set for the lungs. Mail order gives the medicine a wide and gentle reach. It slips past distance on the rail lines. It enters towns where the nearest doctor comes by horse in great importance. On the counter of a country store, the bottle stands beside lamp oil and peppermint sticks. In a city chemist shop, it sits under a clock that loses 7 minutes each week. Everywhere, it borrows respect from its surroundings. The packaging helps. Bayer knows this. Amber glass suggests care. German print suggests science. A clean cork suggests that someone clever has already worried on your behalf. The prices are within reach for many households. The quantities are modest. The repeat purchase, as people would later say with less innocence, is where the story really stretches its legs. A dry cough in winter has a sound every doctor knows. It scratches through waiting rooms and down boarding house halls. It follows people into church pews and tram cars and damp bedrooms. Dr. Wellmeaning hears that sound and reaches for the modern answer. He has a magnificent mustache and total faith in the current medical consensus. Both appear trim that morning. On his desk lies a medical journal with narrow columns and dense black type. The article praises heroin as a fine sedative for coughing. It says the relief arrives promptly and without the burdens of morphine. The language is careful in the way careful language can still be very wrong. There are case notes. There are physician reports. There is that soothing phrase, non-addictive, walking around in its best coat. Bayer circulates studies and summaries to doctors across Europe and America. The papers mention bronchi, doses, and grateful patients who sleep at last. Everything sounds measured and civilized. A doctor reading by lamplight sees German data, tidy tables and hopeful prose. The room smells of paper, tobacco, and wool warmed by the stove. It feels impossible that so much order could lead anywhere untidy. Some articles suggest heroin works better than codeine for certain coughs. Others describe it as useful in tuberculosis, pneumonia, and the nagging chest pains of winter illness. The claims travel quickly because doctors are always busy and hope is efficient. Samples appear in drawers and valises. Reprints arrive folded inside envelopes. Heinrich, the marketing man, pops up in the imagination of every hospital corridor, smiling over another stack of polished pamphlets. He is never vulgar about it. He is all tone and polish and scientific cheer. He could sell Snowfall to a mountain and call it an improvement. Doctors like that heroin seems modern in exactly the right way. It has a chemical name. It comes from a respected firm. It feels like medicine that has passed through machinery, and therefore must know what it is doing. Older remedies carry the smell of poppy sap and old habit. Heroin arrives through bottles, forms, and trademarks. It enters practice as if bureaucracy itself had blessed it. Dr. Wellmeaning writes it for stubborn coughs and delicate chests. He writes it for sleeplessness made worse by coughing. He writes it with the serene confidence of a man who believes the future has finally become sensible. He tells a patient that it should calm the cough without inviting a morphine habit. He tells another that the dose is small and therefore proper. He tells himself that medicine is progressing in a straight line, which is a charming old belief. In journals, the praise continues. A physician in one city reports excellent results. Another agrees from several hundred miles away. The chorus is not loud, yet it is steady enough to feel like truth. There is little reason at first glance to doubt it. Patients do cough less. Some do sleep better. The bottle empties in a reassuringly ordinary way. At a nursery table, the medicine looks even gentler. The spoon is small. The lamp is low. A folded flannel waits beside a bowl of warm water. Children's cough syrups begin to include the same substance in tiny measured amounts. The labels promise rest. The syrup itself is sweet enough to pass with only a slight puzzled face. Sugar covers a great many ideas. So does glycerin. A little flavoring of cherry or anise makes the medicine feel less like chemistry and more like bedtime. A mother wipes the bottle neck with a cloth after each use. Sticky rings dry brown around the lip. The label softens at the edges from damp fingers. No one thinks of the nursery as a place where a century's trouble is practicing its handwriting. It is only a room with soft blankets, warm milk, and a child who finally stops coughing. That is enough for trust. Doctors recommend these syrups because the doses are small and the effect is plain. Less coughing means more sleep. More sleep feels like health, especially at 2 in the morning. The medicine chest keeps its own modest order. Camphor sits beside liniment. Laxative powder sits beside sticking plaster. Heroin syrup takes its place with the calm of a guest who arrives early and never seems rude. Printed directions matter here. Half a teaspoon for one age, fewer drops for another. The numbers look clean and authoritative, which numbers often do before experience starts talking back. Dr. Well-meaning is equally content in a military supply room. There are bandages in folded stacks and tins arranged by size. Leather cases wait open on a wooden table. Some field kits and hospital chests include diacetyl morphine, among other dependable comforts. The doses are compact. The bottles travel well. Quartermasters appreciate anything that stays tidy in transit. A soldier's kit is a place of plain things. Needle and thread, soap, a brush, a small medicine bottle cushioned in wool or paper. In barracks and camps there are coughs, aches, damp boots, and long waits. Military doctors like remedies that come with exact doses and reputable labels. A tiny tablet feels more disciplined than an old dark syrup spooned from memory. The medicine can be packed in tins or carried in corked vials. It takes up little space. It asks very little of the hand that hands it over. Some doctors in uniform use it for cough. Some use it as a general comfort in a hard setting. The small bottle moves from city cabinet to field bag without changing its expression. The labels remain persuasive under every sky. In one place, the bottle rests beside iodine and lint. In another, it shares a chest with quinine and carbolic soap. Everywhere it keeps the same patient look. The world before 1910 loves portable certainty. Heroin provides it in excellent packaging. It is chemistry that fits in a pocket. By then, many respectable pharmacies have a regular flow of repeat buyers. The same names return to the ledger. The same careful handwriting appears in the same neat lines. At first, this seems normal enough. Chronic coughs do linger. Nervous complaints do recur. People do come back for what works. Yet some customers begin arriving earlier than expected. The bottle should not be empty yet, but it is. The explanation offered at the counter is always plain and usually polite. A clerk notices who comes in on rainy afternoons and who appears just before closing. A doctor notes which patients speak less about coughing and more about feeling unable to manage without the medicine. The change is subtle, which is how many large changes begin. These patients do not look like villains from a cautionary poster. They look like school teachers, clerks, widows, seamstresses, and tired men with hats in hand. They look, in other words, inconveniently ordinary. Some were first given heroin after morphine troubles, because it was meant to help with exactly that. Some were given it for coughs and simply found themselves unwilling to stop. Some had no grand story at all, beyond relief that became need. The profession notices this in pieces, rather than all at once. One doctor sees an odd pattern, another thinks he has met an exception, a third assumes his patient lacks discipline, and moves on to luncheon. Many physicians explain the problem away with almost touching creativity. The patient must have had a hidden morphine habit already. The doses must have been misunderstood. The person must have a nervous nature. Weak will is blamed. Female frailty is blamed. Urban strain is blamed. Almost everything is blamed except the celebrated new medicine itself. That is the old dance of a trusted remedy. Praise is assigned to the drug. Trouble is assigned to the patient. Dr. Well-meaning does not think of himself as careless. He keeps careful notes. He adjusts doses. He genuinely wants people to rest. When a few patients return with an unusual hunger for the bottle, he explains it with the logic of his moment. Perhaps they are unusually sensitive. Perhaps they were already disposed to craving. Perhaps the cough itself has unsettled them. He writes another prescription. He gives a gentler warning about moderation. His mustache remains magnificent and slightly ahead of the evidence catching up to him. The first quiet warnings arrive not with drums, but in the correspondence pages of medical journals. A physician near Boston sends in a measured note. He has observed several patients who formed a habit after heroin treatment. The words are restrained. The tone is professional. Nothing in the letter rants or storms or throws a chair. Another doctor writes of patients who ask too often for more. A third mentions that the supposed cure for morphine habits seems in some cases to create a new attachment. The letters sit in print among routine notices and ordinary debate. The Boston pages are read by doctors in offices with cold floors and hot tea. One of them nods and thinks the matter worth watching. Then he turns the page and continues with his day. This is how a warning can be politely ignored. It is not rejected with fury. It is simply placed in a mental drawer labeled interesting, where many important things go to nap. Published praise still outweighs scattered doubt. Bayer's claims still carry the warm authority of a major firm. Doctors still prefer a modern answer to an older mess. A few journals answer the warnings by narrowing them. The problem they suggest occurs only in predisposed patients. Properly used, the medicine remains sound. Misuse belongs to the user, which is an argument with a long career ahead of it. Pharmacy ledgers keep quietly collecting evidence. Refill after refill marks the paper. Each entry looks harmless by itself. A woman sends a servant with a note for another bottle. A man begins visiting more than one chemist in the district. A patient becomes oddly anxious if a prescription is delayed by even a day. Nobody yet speaks of an epidemic. The pattern is still small enough to hide in ordinary life. It settles into routines and receipts and repeated knocks at familiar doors. Felix Hoffman's ghost begins his silent rounds about now. He drifts through the edges of laboratories and hospital halls with deepening dismay. He never says a word, which is probably wise. He pauses beside a tray of sample bottles in a physician's office. He watches a journal fold shut over another cautious warning. Then he follows a shipping crate down the stairs and out toward the railway. The railway is important. So are the docks. Bayer's export program moves with the brisk confidence of a company that knows the world wants what it is selling. Crates are packed with straw and paper and careful invoices. The boxes carry labels in German, French, English, and Spanish. A customs officer can read enough to be reassured. In port cities, the air smells of rope, damp wood, coal smoke, and coffee from somewhere nearby. Cases marked for pharmacies are hoisted, counted, stamped, and moved along. Heroin travels in the same practical company as dye, soap, instruments, and canned food. Europe receives it first through the busy channels of trade and medicine. Clinics in London, Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg know the name soon enough. It enters formularies, drawers, and respectable conversation. In each place, the details shift a little. One doctor prefers tablets, another likes syrup, a third writes for powders folded into paper packets by a pharmacist with very tidy fingers. The salesmen keep pace with the science. Heinrich, the marketing man, reappears beside every new export list, still perfectly dressed and still unable to imagine a downside longer than a leaflet. He is a one-man parade for controlled optimism. Across the Atlantic, the product settles into American medicine with alarming ease and very calm paperwork. Drugstores stock it beside patent remedies and prescription preparations. The distinction between the two is looser than later generations might like to remember. The American market loves mail order and branded trust. A Bayer label carries weight. A farm family in Nebraska can receive the same modern bottle praised in a New York office. Southward, the medicine moves into Latin American ports and pharmacy shelves. In Buenos Aires and Havana, it is known as part of the new medical world. It arrives with catalogs, samples, and the prestige of European manufacture. To the east, it travels through trading houses and colonial routes into the Middle East, India, East Asia, and beyond. In Bombay, Shanghai, Manila, and Yokohama, the same small bottles enter very different lives. The wrapper changes language more easily than the drug changes nature. Doctors in mission hospitals may see it as a clean Western remedy. Urban pharmacists may see it as profitable and reputable. Families may know it only as the bottle that quiets the chest and softens the night. In some places, local firms package similar products under related names. In others, Bayer's own mark becomes the selling point. The cross on the box stands for quality, or so everyone hopes. The spread is helped by a simple fact. Cough is everywhere. Pain is everywhere. Sleeplessness is everywhere. A medicine that promises relief without old complications finds doors already open. By 1900 and the years just after, heroin is not an underground curiosity. It is a modern item of trade. It travels by rail, by steamship, by satchel, by catalog, and by the unquestioning habits of respectable people. In pharmacies from Brussels to Boston, there is the same little ritual. A customer asks, a bottle is fetched, a wrapper is folded with brisk, practiced hands. In homes from Berlin to Buenos Aires, there is another ritual. A spoon is rinsed, a dose is poured, the cork is pressed back with the thumb and turned once for good measure. In doctors' offices from Paris to Philadelphia, the ritual repeats again. A chest is listened to, A notebook opens. Dr. Well-meaning clears his throat and writes the safe modern answer. One can feel how the whole arrangement comforts the age. It turns messy suffering into labels and doses. It gives sickness a printed solution and a company name. That comfort is part of the story. The dark side does not arrive wearing boots and shouting. It arrives wearing clean paper and speaking softly about progress. The first dependent patients continue to gather almost by accident. They are still few enough to be dismissed. They are already many enough to be a pattern. A hospital doctor sees a former morphine patient who now asks only for heroin. A private physician notices a seamstress whose cough ended months ago, yet her visits continue with shy insistence. A chemist begins to recognize footsteps on the shop stair. The profession remains mostly serene. Those cases are regrettable, yes. Still, new medicines often have odd edges at first. The journals are broadly favorable, and the company is reputable. There is also pride involved, though no one says it aloud. Doctors like having a new answer. Patients like believing the age has improved upon old opium bowls and uncertain mixtures. Pharmacists like selling something that appears scientific and well-made. So the early addicted population grows in the cracks of approval. It grows under respectable names and inside modest bottles. It grows while everyone keeps their voice low and their collar straight. At times the explanation becomes almost circular. Heroin cannot be the cause because it is known to be safe. If dependence appears, that proves the patient was unusual before the medicine ever arrived. The letters from Boston and elsewhere remain on record. They are not hidden. They simply do not alter the main music yet. A busy physician has many things competing for notice. There are infants with fever. There are broken bones. There are bills to pay and lectures to attend and boots to get resold. Against all that, a few printed warnings seem easy to file away. Heinrich's bright pamphlets are shorter and more cheerful. Human nature has always found that efficient. The export trade continues with admirable organization. Warehouse ledgers fill. Telegraphs confirm orders. Rail cars carry cases inland under a film of soot. At the far end of those routes, the bottles are unpacked by clerks who know nothing of the Boston letters. They know only that demand is real and the stock should be rotated. New labels gleam where straw dust has not yet settled. In warm climates the syrup thickens differently. In dry ones the cork shrinks if neglected. Pharmacists learn these small practical lessons before they learn the larger one. By the later years of this first decade, heroin has become both ordinary and strangely slippery. It belongs to cough medicine, to children's bottles, to doctors' bags, to military chests, and to mail-order parcels. It also belongs more quietly to the first set of people who cannot quite let it go. That double life is still easy to miss. Most bottles are used as intended. Most doctors act in good faith. Most sales look exactly like any other respectable purchase. This is what makes the early chapter so odd. The danger is not hidden in a cellar. It is standing in plain view under gaslight with a price tag and a good reputation. In the Elberfeld lab, the amber bottles once seemed to promise only modern relief. Their glass still catches winter light with the same innocent shine. The shelf has not changed, though the world beyond it has started to. You can almost hear the soft chain of routine linking everything together. The factory fills the order. The pharmacist folds the paper. The patient sleeps, then returns. By 1910, the substance has crossed borders more easily than most people ever will. It has entered languages, ledgers, and household habits. It has also begun to teach doctors that a bottle can be both remedy and trap, while still looking exactly the same. That lesson comes slowly. It arrives through repeat prescriptions and uneasy letters, and patients who seem too ordinary for the old excuses. It arrives while respectable men continue speaking in reasonable tones. Heinrich the marketing man would still tell you everything is perfectly under control. Dr. Well-meaning would still believe he is using the best tool available. Felix Hoffmann's ghost would simply stand in the doorway and look tired. And so, the little bottle leaves this early chapter much as it entered. It is polished, trusted, and almost absurdly easy to obtain. It sits on the shelf like progress itself, while the first shadows gather quietly around the label. On a desk in Washington, the paper smells faintly of fresh ink and wool gloves drying by a radiator. A clerk smooths the page with 2 fingers and checks the date twice before blotting the signature. The law looks neat and harmless there, like a recipe card for order. Far away, in Elberfeld, The pale winter light still seems trapped inside memory. The chemical tang of acetyl anhydride hangs over that mahogany shelf of amber bottles. Nobody in that room imagined American tax forms would become part of the story. The Harrison Narcotic Tax Act of 1914 did not announce itself as a grand ban. It dressed itself in filing habits, registration numbers, and stamps bought from the federal government. It sounded less like thunder and more like a busy post office. You can almost hear drawers sliding open in drugstores across the country. Corked bottles click together behind glass doors that need a small brass key. Labels mention opium, morphine, coca leaves, and the sober comfort of standardized medicine. Lawmakers said they wanted records, not drama. They wanted importers listed, wholesalers counted, and prescription slips signed in an orderly hand. They wanted chemicals to move through proper channels wearing little paper hats of legality. It was America's first attempt to solve a drug problem through paperwork. It went about as well as most later attempts, though the forms were tidier and the stamps were fresh. Everyone trusted the ledger more than the body for a while. The wording left a soft gray cloud in the room. Doctors could still prescribe narcotics in the course of professional practice. Those 6 calm words would soon do an astonishing amount of work. At first, many physicians read the act with a shrug. A busy doctor already kept account books, office cards, and little envelopes of powder samples. One more rule seemed manageable between the morning coughs and the afternoon corns. Dr. Well-Meaning appears here in a stiff collar and shining boots. His mustache is magnificent and utterly sure of itself, as usual. He signs his forms with a fountain pen that scratches like a polite cricket. He believes, as many did, that dependent patients should be kept comfortable and steady. He has seen seamstresses, clerks, and veterans live ordinary days on measured doses. He thinks routine is better than chaos, and breakfast should come before philosophy. In many shops, the narcotics ledger sits beside the seed catalog and the account for cough lozenges. The same hand records castor oil, peppermint, and morphine in the same steady script. That sameness matters because it shows how ordinary these drugs had once seemed. The Treasury Department reads the law more narrowly than many doctors expected. Its agents prefer numbers that add up neatly, and patients who eventually disappear from the books. Maintenance begins to look suspicious when viewed from a long federal hallway. A pharmacist folds the new tax stamp into a ledger and closes the cover. The paper crackles beside columns of dates, grains, ounces, and neat surnames. Order seems possible when everything fits inside ruled lines. Yet bodies do not always keep to ruled lines. Dependence does not lift its hat simply because Congress has spoken. It waits in boarding houses, kitchens, and back bedrooms with the same patient habits as ever. For years, some people have received regular medical supplies with little fuss. A doctor wrote a script, and a chemist counted tablets into a paper packet, or measured syrup into brown glass. Then someone went home and made tea, or folded washing, or answered letters. Some dependent patients had begun with respectable medical advice years before. Childbirth, tooth work, injured backs, and lingering coughs all left their little paper trails. No one at the start imagines a future argument about federal definitions in Washington. The difference between regulation and prohibition can be very small at the counter. It can be the length of a sentence on a form. It can be a pharmacist looking over his spectacles and quietly saying no. In courtrooms, the gray cloud begins to harden into shape. Judges ask whether prescribing to maintain dependence is treatment or merely convenience. The answer matters greatly to people who are not in the room. By 1919, the Webb decision narrows the door. It tells doctors that keeping an addict comfortable is not proper medical practice under the Act. The legal room for maintenance shrinks to the width of a sigh. Doctors begin trimming prescriptions into smaller amounts or stopping them altogether. Some do this from caution, and some do it from fear of prosecution. The patient hears only the scrape of certainty being removed from the day. Another case follows, and then another. Each ruling makes physicians more careful and patients more anxious in waiting rooms across the country. The room grows quieter, except for the rustle of newspapers and winter coats. You sit there with them for a moment in the stale, warm air. The radiator taps softly near a rubber plant that has seen better weeks. A mother unwraps a scarf, and a man turns his hat in his hands until the felt shines. Many of these patients do not look like villains from the later posters. They look tired and tidy, with clean collars, sensible shoes, and medicine bottles wrapped in yesterday's paper. They speak in the same low tones as anyone else in a surgery. The law had promised supervision and restraint. In practice, it began cutting people away from the very system that knew their names and habits. A gap opened between need and legal supply, and gaps are industrious little things. The first days of that gap are plain and domestic. A woman returns to a doctor who now shakes his head with sincere regret. A clerk tries a different pharmacy and hears the same answer under brighter lights. Dependence announces itself through ordinary discomfort before anything dramatic arrives. There is restlessness that makes the chair feel wrong and the bedsheet feel too tight. There are chills in a warm room and the strange insult of soup smelling suddenly enormous. Families improvise in quiet ways. They stretch doses, water mixtures, and ask cousins for small loans without giving much reason. The household clock seems louder than usual, especially after midnight. Druggists, once the careful middlemen of pharmaceutical respectability, begin stepping back from the edge. Their scales are still polished, and their drawers are still labeled in firm ink. But the risk of inspection now hangs over the counter like a second lamp. Here the dealer is not born as a shadowy master of vice. He arrives as a supply answer, often a porter, a bellboy, a cab driver, or a man who knows a man. He understands that when legal channels close, someone always sells a key. He carries no grand theory. He carries little folded papers, stoppered vials, and a memory for addresses, staircases, and discreet knocks. That is often enough to found a trade. The street market is at first improvised and small. A tenement hallway does the work of a clinic, and a pool room back table becomes a rough desk. A boarding house landlady learns far more than she ever wished to know. Prices wobble because nobody has built a proper ladder yet. One day a dose costs the price of a decent supper, and another day it costs a week's coal money. Purity varies with the honesty of several strangers and the care of one borrowed scale. The first sellers learn packaging from the world around them. Powder goes into paper twists, tiny envelopes, or empty pill boxes saved from better days. An elastic band around folded packets becomes for someone a business system. Pharmaceutical supply had once arrived in labeled bottles with measured strength. Now powders may be cut, stretched, or borrowed from other products moving through odd channels. The old certainty of the chemist's scale fades, and trust becomes a local rumor. Bayer by then is already loosening its grip on the story. Its patent had expired, and the proud proprietary glow had gone dull around the edges. Heroin was no longer one firm's modern marvel in a tidy branded box. Once there had been glossy pamphlets and doctor endorsements. Bayer's launch was basically a Victorian influencer campaign, only with better cuffs and no comments section. Heinrich the marketing man would have adored every printed claim and every polished assurance. But expired patents are quiet little funerals. The molecule leaves home and starts renting rooms under other names with less supervision. Generic makers, wholesalers, and importers shuffle in, each responsible for a slice and none for the whole. The amber bottle on the mahogany shelf becomes memory instead of stewardship. If complaints arise, they drift across too many desks to settle properly anywhere. No single company stands under the full weather of the consequences. Felix Hoffmann's ghost moves through this part in silence. He had given the world aspirin and diacetyl morphine in the same busy week. One became the sensible tablet in the bathroom cabinet, and the other slipped its collar and wandered. In offices and pharmacies, the corporate story grows faint. People still know the name heroin, but they know it as a thing and not a brand. Accountability evaporates with remarkable politeness when enough papers change hands. The new street sellers notice that demand is steady and predictable. They learn hours, neighborhoods, and the small habits of frightened customers who prefer familiar faces. A folded note under a saucer can matter as much as any formal contract. Some supply comes from theft or diversion. Some comes from doctors still willing to risk generous prescriptions for known patients. Some comes from leftover stocks bought before the rules tightened and the windows darkened. All of it moves by rumor, shoe leather, and trust held together with pins. A customer asks a porter, and the porter asks a cousin, and the cousin knows a room. Supply chains, even shabby ones, are patient creatures when profit feeds them. The newspapers soon find a new sort of story they enjoy more. The patient becomes the suspect, and the prescription becomes the pretext for moral theater. A medical case history begins edging toward the police blotter. Police stations add new columns to old forms. Age, address, occupation, nationality, and supposed habits are entered in careful script by tired clerks. Bureaucracy loves a fresh category because naming a thing feels almost like managing it. Language matters more than people notice at first. Habitude sounds European and slightly dusty, while addict sounds harder and easier to print in bold type. Soon, uglier nicknames appear because headlines prefer rough edges and short syllables. The cultural turn is swift and oddly practical. A person once discussed in terms of dosage is now described in terms of danger and temptation. A doctor's office file gives way to a station house card, though ink remains central to both. The senator arrives right on time for this part. He is never exactly the same man twice, yet somehow always exactly the same man. He stands before reporters and declares a decisive victory over disorder by mid-afternoon. Behind him are potted palms, water glasses, and a blackboard of reassuring figures. He speaks of control, purity, and the end of irresponsible traffic in solemn tones. His press release is folded crisply enough to cut paper. Outside the frame, people are already adjusting to the new inconvenience. They memorize side streets, borrow from cousins, and learn which bell to ring after dusk. Federal order can create excellent business opportunities for unlicensed entrepreneurs with good memory. Heinrich, the marketing man, would call it a distribution problem and offer brighter packaging. He is always impeccably dressed, sincerely confident, and catastrophically wrong in every decade. Institutions keep hiring his spirit because certainty looks so tidy at first glance. The earliest dealers do not yet look like a fixed underworld. They look like temporary answers wearing ordinary hats and carrying borrowed respectability. Yet the role hardens quickly once enough customers depend on it every morning. Law has a talent for giving jobs names without meaning to. It creates stable customers, unstable access, and a premium on discretion all at once. By punishing legal sellers, it quietly rewards risky ones with better margins. City police notice the change and begin learning a new trade. Plainclothesmen linger near drugstores and rooming houses with pocket notebooks and damp collars. Those notebooks fill with aliases, street corners, and details that smell faintly of wet wool. A person once treated as chronically ill now risks being read as secretly wicked. That shift settles into posture, voice, and neighborhood gossip long before it reaches a judge. It becomes something carried in the shoulders and not just in official papers. Even the walk to seek help changes its meaning. Entering a doctor's door once suggested care, while waiting near a known corner suggests suspicion. Geography starts issuing diagnoses of its own, and none of them are very kind. Not everyone accepts the new arrangement. Some doctors and city officials see the obvious problem with cutting dependent people loose from medical care. If legal supply has been closed, they reason, medicine might still keep a hand on the door. So the maintenance clinic appears, modestly and with municipal plainness. It often occupies scrubbed rooms with a carbolic smell, sturdy chairs and windows that rattle in winter. The furniture is disappointing in exactly the right civic way. You can hear shoes on tile and a cough in the hallway. Coats hang damp from pegs, and a clerk sits behind a desk with index cards and a stamp pad. He has the patient patience of a man who files everything. In these clinics, dependence is treated as a medical fact rather than a sermon topic. People line up in the morning, names are checked, and doses are measured with practiced hands. Then the day proceeds with an almost bureaucratic calm that feels strangely hopeful. Sometimes the dose is morphine, sometimes it is heroin itself, given under watch, with records kept and bottles clearly labeled. Spoons are washed, glasses are rinsed, and ordinary procedure does most of the talking. That ordinary quality is important. A patient might arrive with a lunch pail or a seamstress's bag and pay a small fee. She might go from the clinic straight to work, with little ceremony. Nurses learn faces and not just symptoms. They notice who has gained weight, who finally slept, and who has started combing his hair again. Public health can sound very unromantic when it is working in plain daylight. Clinic mornings have a rhythm recognizable from any public office. Doors open at a set hour, pens are borrowed and returned, and someone always asks for water. A man complains gently about the stove, which is always either too hot or not hot enough. These early clinics are not utopias. They are crowded, underfunded, and argued over by men in dark suits with excellent collars. Yet for a brief moment, they show a different future in practical shoes. Reports from some cities note fewer arrests and steadier lives. Shopkeepers complain less about nuisance, and families breathe a little easier over breakfast tables. Municipal medicine, wearing its plain coat, seems almost embarrassingly sensible. Some clinics even collect the humble data of ordinary life. They note who kept a job, who reunited with family, and who stopped buying on the street. Success here looks very dull on paper, and dull can be a blessing. Dr. Well-meaning thrives in such places. His mustache approves of schedules, and he believes measured supply can anchor a life better than moral thunder. He keeps a clock on his desk 5 minutes slow, as if to soften the day. But federal officials grow impatient with this experiment. To them, clinics look like sanctioned indulgence dressed up as care and filing. The same paperwork once meant to regulate now becomes a tool for closing doors with grave expressions. Court decisions and enforcement pressure gather like cold weather. Cities receive warnings, doctors receive threats of prosecution, and funding grows suddenly timid. The morning line shortens, not because need is gone, but because legality has stepped back again. One by one, most American maintenance clinics close in the early 1920s. Desks are cleared, bottles are boxed, and ledger books are tied with string and shelved. The experiment ends with clerical neatness, which seems almost rude. The closure of the clinic can be heartbreakingly practical. Chairs are stacked, the measuring glass is wrapped in newspaper, and a nurse takes home a potted fern. Public policy often ends with someone carrying a box down a hallway. Patients do not vanish when clinics do. They simply return to the older map of stairs, alleys, and whispered introductions after dusk. The gap in supply, briefly bridged by medicine, opens wider than before. This is the part where the law invents a profession without ever writing the title down. It creates stable customers and unstable access at exactly the same time. Economics, like mold, blooms where the wall stays damp and undisturbed. In neighborhoods near docks and rail yards, small networks become sturdier. Someone knows a pharmacist in another city, and someone else knows a sailor with a trunk. Supply chains, even shameful ones, love to mature if enough money waits at the end. The old respectability of pharmacy still echoes inside the Mew market. Street sellers borrow the language of medicine because customers remember it from better counters. Powders are called strong, clean, or pure, as if the chemist still stood nearby. The loss of Bayer's patent matters here, in a quiet but real way. When heroin ceased to be a guarded novelty, it became easier to make, copy, and trade. The brand that once framed the product no longer contained its reputation. Heroin, once sold with branded confidence, now travels as a generic commodity. That sounds dry, but dry words often hide the largest shifts in modern life. A branded medicine carries a parent, or at least pretends to, while a generic trade carries only the invoice. Bayer itself was also drifting through other storms. Patents expired and markets changed with the steady dullness of normal business life. Then war and anti-German feeling scrambled names and ownership across the Atlantic. A corporation that once advertised calm relief was now in no position to shepherd the aftermath. Responsibility thinned out across borders, invoices, wholesalers, pharmacists, and ordinary habits of trade. No one held the whole chain long enough to answer for the whole chain. If anyone wished to ask who had loosed this thing into common trade, the answer became foggy. The original maker could point to time and patent law, while later firms could point elsewhere. Everyone had somewhere else to point, and Felix Hoffmann's ghost only looked out the window. In the public mind, however, blame prefers a face. It settles less on firms than on users, and it chooses the shabby coat over the distant boardroom. It has always had better access to the shabby coat. This new focus also flatters institutions. If the problem is a bad sort of person, then laws stay noble and systems stay wise. If the problem lies partly in policy, the speeches need revision, and politicians dislike that tailoring. Police photographs begin to replace medical illustrations in popular imagination. Reporters describe raids more eagerly than treatment, and judges talk about vice more than dosing schedules. The same body is now arranged under different lighting and given a harder caption. Some dependent people still find private doctors who will help quietly. Money and respectability can soften the edges of enforcement in rooms with thick carpets and quiet clocks. Poorer patients rarely receive that kind of upholstered legal cushioning. So the new criminal identity does not land evenly. It falls hardest where housing is tight, privacy is scarce, and ordinary need is easiest to see. The law has always admired visibility and taken a special interest in crowded streets. Respectability can also be rented by architecture. A private office with a rug and umbrella stand makes the same dependence seem clinical. A hallway bench and a patrolman's glance make it seem criminal before a word is spoken. A woman buying a small legal supply for migraine or cough may pass unnoticed. A laborer waiting on a stoop for an illicit dose usually does not enjoy that invisibility. The substance has not changed, but the setting has changed everything around it. Even physicians begin adjusting their language to the climate. They write more cautiously in case notes and use words like weakness or bad character more freely. The pen stiffens with the times and leaves a colder trail. Medical schools also shift the lesson. Young doctors are warned against creating addicts with generous prescribing, which is sensible in one way, yet it also teaches distance from those already dependent. And sympathy becomes professionally risky. The cultural picture grows crowded with stereotypes and tidy little fears. Newspapers love the strange story of hidden vice, and reformers love the grand speech. Neither spends much time noticing the kitchen table, the unpaid rent, or the soup going cold. Meanwhile, the street market gets better at being a market. Orders are placed through bellboys, barbers, and boys selling newspapers at corners and stations. Money travels in tobacco tins, folded letters, and pockets stitched shut twice. There are now preferred sellers and bad sellers, regular hours and known corners. A customer can compare quality with the serious boredom of any repeat purchaser. Even illegality settles into routine once it has been given a few seasons. Customers also develop habits of review, though never in writing. One source is said to be weak, while another is praised for punctuality and steadier supply. The whole arrangement has the dreary consumer logic of any repeat market. The dealer keeps notes too, though not always on paper. He remembers who pays on Tuesday, who wants credit, and who asks too many questions. He is less a melodramatic villain than an awkward entrepreneur shaped by bad policy. This does not make the trade gentle. It makes it ordinary, which can be more unsettling in a sleepy and familiar way. Human beings can normalize almost anything if the transaction repeats often enough between meals. The kettle still boils, and rent still comes due. Laundry still waits in baskets, and someone still mends a cuff by the window. Even a black market lives inside ordinary domestic time and borrows its furniture. The senator eventually notices that the problem has not, in fact, dissolved. He responds in the only language he trusts, which is more speeches and sterner penalties. There are newer promises of final control, always printed on very good paper. Felix Hoffman's ghost takes no notes at all. He simply stands near the tall window, hands at his sides, and watches history improvise. He does not speak, because there is nothing useful left for him to add. Yet even in this hardening climate, small medical countercurrents remain. Some hospital doctors continue arguing that dependence is an illness with physical and social dimensions. A few public health thinkers study maintenance with stubborn interest in plain folders. In certain wards, treatment means warm blankets, broth, and observation rather than accusation. The room smells of soap and steam, and someone checks a pulse by the bed. A nurse straightens the sheet and writes the hour in the chart. Recovery in these early years is spoken of quietly and without fanfare. It may mean a religious mission bed, a sanitarium with porridge, or simply a week of safety. Often it means getting through tomorrow with a little less fear than today. Early recovery spaces are often filled with very plain objects. There are iron beds, chipped enamel basins, oatmeal, Bible verses, and clocks that move slowly. Improvement is measured in sleep, appetite, and the ability to sit through breakfast. None of these paths is smooth or widely available. Many are moralizing, some are expensive, and some confuse discipline with healing in familiar ways. Still, they preserve a thin idea that will matter later, which is that treatment is possible. The old patient identity has not fully vanished. It flickers at the edges in hospital corridors, clinic reports, and the private thoughts of careful doctors. But in public culture, the criminal image is winning because it is simpler for speeches. There are fewer labeled bottles from pharmacists and more anonymous packets folded by uncertain hands. There are fewer appointment cards, and more court dates tucked into coat pockets. Back in memory, the Bayer laboratory remains unnervingly calm. Pale winter light rests on the tall factory windows exactly as it did in 1898. Amber bottles gleam on the shelf as if order were the natural state of chemistry. The strange thing is how little the molecule itself cares about these stories. It does not know whether it sits in a pharmacist's drawer or a coat pocket. Human systems wrap it in meaning, while the powder remains stubbornly unliterary. Heinrich the marketing man would probably still call this a manageable branding issue. Dr. Well-meaning would ask for more clinic hours and stronger coffee before the afternoon rush. The senator would schedule another press conference before lunch and call that progress. And that is how a tax law became a border in daily life. On one side stood the patient, the pharmacist, and the measured bottle with a proper label. On the other stood the dealer, the patrolman, and the folded paper passed hand to hand. America crossed that line more quickly than it understood. Once crossed, the line proved very hard to uncross, because new routines grew around it at once. Treatment would spend the next century trying to argue its way back through the doorway. In a quiet Bayer archive, the old pamphlets had begun to curl at the corners. They showed smiling mothers, tidy doctors, and a cough syrup said to be modern and mild. Dust lay on the paper in a soft gray film. The ink still looked proud. On a shelf nearby, a row of amber glass bottles caught the pale light. The labels had browned a little with age. The smell of old paper and old chemicals sat together like distant cousins. Somewhere in that room, if one allowed for ghosts, Felix Hoffman stood in silence again. He had made aspirin and diacetylmorphine in the same brisk week. The expression on his face had not improved with time. Heinrich the marketing man would once have loved this room. He would have smoothed his cuffs and spoken warmly about reach, trust, and exciting new markets. His pamphlets now slept in boxes while other men built a larger business. The substance had left the shelf and learned to travel without him. It no longer needed glossy claims or embossed letterheads. It needed fields, boats, ledgers, loyal cousins, and 1,000 small silences. At dawn in western Turkey, the poppy heads stood in neat rows under a sky the color of tin. The plants were pale green with a dusty bloom on the leaves. Their round seed pods lifted on straight stems. The fields looked almost too tidy for the trade they would feed. A farmer walked between them with a small knife fitted with several blades. He held the pod in one hand and drew the tool across the skin. The cuts were shallow and careful. The milky sap beat it slowly where the pod had been scored. By the next morning, it would darken and thicken. Then it could be scraped away in sticky brown strips. His hands smelled of earth, raw sap, and wool from his coat sleeves. A donkey waited by the path with sacks folded over its back. Nearby, tea steamed in a glass set on a flat stone. This was not yet the shadowy underworld of later films. It was farming first. It was rows, weather, aching shoulders, and a government clerk somewhere keeping papers in order. Turkey had long grown poppies under rules and licenses. Opium still had lawful uses in medicine. In theory, the crop moved through neat channels, with stamps, quotas, and official receipts. In practice, some of it wandered. A little gum sold off the books could help mend a roof. A little morphine base hidden inside a larger stream could pay several debts at once. The border between lawful and unlawful was often only a second ledger. The villages knew the rhythm well. Men sharpened the scoring knives at dusk. Women spread cloths and checked sacks for holes. Children chased hens between dying trays and did not ask many questions. The poppy itself kept an innocent face. Its flowers had already fallen by harvest time. Only the pods remained, round and dull, like quiet lamps after the party. From the fields, the gum went to traders who handled it with practiced calm. They weighed it on small metal scales. They wrapped it in waxed paper, cloth, or whatever the moment offered. Some loads moved openly enough under legal cover. Some slipped away through cousins and drivers and men who preferred cash. A truck carrying fruit could carry more than fruit. The roads from Anatolia to the coast were full of ordinary noises. Engines coughed on mountain bends. Tires crackled over gravel. At roadside cafes, Spoons knocked against tea glasses in a patient little music. No map drawn for school children showed the next steps. There was no red line from field to alley. The route lived in memory, habit, and family lunch tables. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, the work was finding new managers. On a Sicilian hillside, a rented farmhouse sat among olive trees and loose stone walls. The shutters stayed half closed even at noon. Chickens scratched in the yard. Inside, the kitchen held a table, enamel bowls, a coal stove, and smells that did not belong in any cookbook. The smell was familiar, as one had once stood in Elberfeld. There it was again, a sharp chemical tang, faintly sweet and faintly sour, hanging over the room. Acetic anhydride had traveled farther than Heinrich ever did. Morphine base reached places like this in hidden bundles and patient stages. It arrived in cars with dusty tires, in boats with chipped paint, and under sacks of grain. Nobody announced it with a brass band. The farmhouse could pass, at a glance, for any place making preserves. Jars stood on shelves, aprons hung by the door, a pot simmered with tomato and onion for the midday meal. Only the other equipment gave the game away. There were filters, tins, glassware, scales, and stains that never quite washed out. The work needed heat, timing, and a chemist who knew more than he said. Sicilian families had long managed shipping, favors, and quiet enforcement across the island. After the war, they found that opiates moved nicely through the same old channels. The sea was still there, and so were the cousins. Corsican chemists and gangsters added another useful talent. They knew Marseille. They knew the docks, the warehouses, the union politics, and the back rooms where a crate could rest unnoticed for one more night. The chain was almost elegant in its plainness. Turkish poppies fed opium. Opium became morphine base. Morphine base moved west and south. Then chemists finished the job in borrowed rooms with drawn curtains. War had scattered many old systems and left many hungry men standing beside them. Black markets already handled cigarettes, coffee, silk stockings, and rationed fuel. Heroin slipped into those habits as if taking the next seat. The new trade borrowed from older trades. It used shippers who knew manifests and porters who knew shortcuts. It trusted a man whose uncle had once moved olive oil just as much as a man who had not. A package might be wrapped in greaseproof paper and tied with kitchen string. A sample might sit inside a tobacco tin. A ledger might hide inside a prayer book or beneath a tray of invoices. None of it looked grand at close range. It looked cramped and practical. It looked like people forever making room on crowded tables. Lucky Luciano sat in cafes and let the city come to him. He had been sent back to Italy after prison in America. He carried fame, caution, and a talent for listening. A cup of coffee could last him an hour if the company was good. He did not invent the trade from nothing. Very few people in this story truly invent anything. They mostly inherit a working machine and improve the packaging. That was the pharmaceutical lesson, and organized crime learned it well. A corporation had once sold a branded solution in clean bottles. Now a looser empire sold an unbranded solution in packets and whispers. The basic idea was still distribution. Luciano had contacts in Sicily, contacts in Naples, and old ties across the Atlantic. He understood that supply mattered less without steady delivery. He thought in routes, not speeches. He also understood the value of routine. A route survives when it becomes boring to the men who operate it. The best smuggling often looked, from the outside, like men going to work. So there were meetings in cafes with marble tables and tired waiters. There were coded phone calls made from public booths. There were little nods over cards, cigarettes, and sugar packets. American crime families wanted product they could trust. The neighborhoods they controlled already moved gambling, loans, and vice through stable chains of command. Heroin could be added to the list with the same dry efficiency. In that sense, the underworld inherited an old pharmaceutical dream. It wanted purity, regular supply, recognizable sources, and loyal retailers. Heinrich, the marketing man, would have admired the brand discipline before fainting. At the same time, a few officials still liked to imagine the trade as scattered and local. They preferred the comfort of isolated bad apples. Networks are harder to admit because networks suggest skill. By the Marseille docks, ropes creaked against wet stone and diesel hung in the morning air. The port was busy enough to swallow many secrets simply through size. Cranes groaned above pallets of soap, wine, machinery, dried fruit, and cloth. Customs men had lists longer than their patience. Marseille was not chosen for romance. It was chosen because it worked. Ships came and went in numbers that made close attention a luxury. Warehouses offered corners, and corners invite habits. Corsican gangs had deep roots in the city. They had wartime ties, labor ties, nightclub ties, and political usefulness. They knew which foreman drank too much and which clerk preferred envelopes. The route from Turkey often passed through the eastern Mediterranean by sea or overland by truck. Morphing base might reach Lebanon, Sicily, or southern France by several paths. Flexibility was part of its strength. Once it reached Marseille, small labs did the final refining. They were hidden in apartments, workshops, or back rooms above legitimate trades. Laundry steam, kitchen smells, and city soot helped blur the chemical air. The finished product was then packed for export in units that traveled well. Some went in luggage with trusted couriers. Some slipped into cargo hidden among more boring goods. Boring goods were always the safest friends. The mechanics were patient, rather than dramatic. A courier booked passage on a liner under a neat false name. A dock worker looked away at the right minute. A suitcase gained weight without changing its smile. Some shipments moved inside cars sent across the Atlantic. Some moved through mailed parcels or freight with altered papers. Some simply rode with people who seemed too ordinary to interest anyone. It was essentially 19th century overnight delivery, just with more Marseille dock workers, and a great deal more Sicilian middle management. Money returned by similarly patient routes. Cash was broken into manageable amounts, washed through businesses, or carried by hand. A bar, a trucking firm, and a fruit importer could all become useful accountants. The chain relied on boredom, trust, and repetition. A man wore the same hat each trip. A clerk stamped the same forms after lunch. A captain preferred to dock on Tuesdays if the tide allowed. When people later told the story, they often made it sleek and cinematic. In truth, much of it was waiting around for paperwork and arguing about storage. Crime, like shipping, turns out to involve many keys. Yet the route had a strange polish. Marseille gave it a name. The French connection sounded like perfume and trench coats. It was really a long queue of men guarding boxes. In the bars near the harbor, one could hear many languages in the same room. Glasses clicked. Anchovies sat in shallow dishes. A radio whispered dance music through static, while someone checked a pocket notebook. The city had its own reasons for looking sideways. Jobs were scarce after the war. Politics at the docks were fierce. If a crate came through under the protection of useful men, many preferred not to see too clearly. Cold War officials sometimes preferred the same fog. In offices far from the quay, maps lay under ashtrays and coffee rings. The enemy of the day wore the color red. That made many other colors seem forgivable for a while. French intelligence and Allied interests had worried deeply about communist strength in Marseille's unions. Corsican gangsters could be unpleasant partners, but they were reliable anti-communists when properly encouraged. This bought them room to operate. A blind eye is rarely fully shut. It squints. It notices enough to stay informed, but not enough to interrupt the arrangement. Bureaucracy can perform this facial expression for years. Turkey was also useful in larger strategic thinking. It sat near Soviet power and later stirred within the Western alliance. Pressing too hard on poppy growing could upset farmers and officials in a valuable place. So the route benefited from the priorities of the age. Communism had become the great organizing fear. If opiates funded friendly men or passed through friendly ports, the discomfort stayed mostly on paper. This was not a single grand plan. It was a pile of small decisions. One official postponed a raid, another protected a source, a third decided there were bigger dangers for this quarter's report. That kind of neglect can build an empire as neatly as ambition can. Back in Marseille, the work remained stubbornly ordinary. Someone bought coffee for the room, someone mended a torn cuff, someone cursed because a scale had gone out of balance again. Felix Hoffman's ghost might have drifted through those rooms with widening eyes. The same family of chemicals still haunted the air. The mahogany shelf had become a cheap apartment table, but the smell remembered everything. Once the heroin landed in New York, another network took over. At the piers and terminals, the city received goods from everywhere and judged very little by scent alone. Bananas ripened in warehouses, newsprint arrived in bales, Longshoremen moved through their shifts with hooks, chalk, and luck. From the docks, small parcels moved to middlemen, stash apartments, and trusted cars. The American mafia had neighborhoods, crews, and a practiced sense of territory. Distribution no longer needed invention, only maintenance. The great trick was not merely to import, it was to break bulk without breaking order. A kilogram meant one thing in Marseille and many smaller things in New York. At each step, more hands touched the product and more profit peeled away. Wholesalers cut deals in diners and social clubs. Retail corners were assigned, defended by custom as much as by threat, and supplied in careful measure. To a modern eye, it can look almost corporate. There were tiers, regions, trusted suppliers, unreliable subcontractors, and occasional quality complaints. Heinrich would have called it an integrated rollout and ordered better stationery. The city itself helped the trade because cities always help the trades they host. Apartments stacked people close together. Cash moved quickly. Police departments were busy with many other troubles and many paperwork drawers. Heroin did not settle evenly across the map. It gathered in poor districts, in working neighborhoods under pressure, and in places where earlier markets had already taught useful lessons. Networks prefer old roads. By the 1950s, Harlem was one of those places. In a Harlem hallway, coal dust mixed with cooking smells and damp winter coats. Someone on the third floor fried onions in a skillet. Someone downstairs tuned a radio between stations. The banister felt worn smooth where many hands had turned the corner. The neighborhood carried elegance and strain at once. Churches opened their doors early. Barbershops buzzed with argument and hair tonic. Children skipped around broken patches in the pavement as if it were a game. Heroin entered this world through street networks, social ties, and the quiet logic of availability. It was sold in small packets, cheap enough to seem manageable, and common enough to feel near. Nearness matters more than headlines. Journalists and later filmmakers loved to tie Harlem heroin to jazz. The image was too tempting to resist. A horn case, a late set, a smoky room, and a tragic glamour were easier to print than rent trouble. There was some truth in the club story, because musicians lived odd hours and wore their nerves thin. Some used heroin, some talked about it, some died young and left the myth polished behind them. But the myth hid more than it showed. Most users were not standing under stage lights. They were porters, laborers, veterans, clerks, women keeping house, and teenagers growing up too close to the trade. The newspapers liked a saxophone better than a stairwell. The street market thrived on routine again. A runner knew which stoop to use in rain. A seller knew which hours brought pay packets. A customer knew how to fold a bill so the exchange looked like nothing at all. In after-hours clubs, coffee sat black and strong in thick cups. Ashtrays overflowed. Men in narrow ties spoke softly at the edge of the room, while drums and bass did their patient work. Those rooms carried both style and fatigue. They were not magical dens of sin, as lurid magazines preferred. They were workplaces with bad ventilation and too many long nights. Some musicians believed heroin steadied them. Some claimed it made the hours blur more gently. Many others simply tried to avoid it and keep the gig. The music never needed the drug as much as the story did. Meanwhile, families in Harlem watched ordinary things go missing first. A watch disappeared. A rent envelope thinned. Promises became less reliable on Mondays than they had been on Fridays. Dr. Well-Meaning also made his rounds in these years, mustache first as always. He had newer sedatives for nerves, newer pills for sleep, and much confidence in supervised modern medicine. Evidence, poor thing, was still catching the next train. Public officials responded in familiar ways. There were speeches about vice, youth, and cleansing the streets. The senator or one of his well-barbered cousins arrived with charts and certainty, and absolutely no sense of sequel. Crackdowns could scatter a market without ending it. A block grew hot. So the trade stepped sideways. Arrests removed small sellers while larger suppliers adjusted their diaries and carried on. Harlem also became a warning sign used by people who rarely visited it. Politicians pointed toward the neighborhood as if it were a lesson rather than a place. Residents still had to buy bread, mend coats, and get children to school in the morning. The route from Marseille to New York was now measured not only in miles, but in habits. A field in Turkey touched a tenement kitchen through layers of men who never met. The chain held because each link stayed busy. Elsewhere in America, the same pattern appeared in Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, and beyond. Urban markets grew where poverty, segregation, and street experience offered fertile ground. Heroin traveled along rail lines, bus routes, and kin networks. The romance of the French Connection often covered the plainness of its destinations. The endpoint was usually not a velvet booth. It was a cramped room with unpaid bills and someone waiting by the window. Back in Europe, Marseille kept loading ships. Dock life ran on timetables, whistles, and damp ledgers. Men rolled barrels along planks darkened by salt water. Tar, rope, orange peels, and fish made their own rough perfume over the harbor. The city also exported stories about itself. By the 1960s, reporters loved to describe an invisible kingdom run from cafes and alleys. That picture was not wholly false, but it gave too much credit to glamour. Much of the work belonged to middle figures whose names never became famous. A cousin arranged a van, a bookkeeper moved figures from one page to another, a landlord asked no questions if the rent arrived in cash. One can almost see Heinrich studying them with professional jealousy. He had once pushed a product with pamphlets and doctor endorsements. These men used kinship, port labor, and a waiter who knew which table to reserve. American authorities slowly understood that the route was international and stubborn. The old hope that customs alone could stop it began to look thin. The Harrison Narcotic Tax Act had been an early attempt to solve the problem through paperwork, which went about as well as later attempts. So attention shifted to crop control, international policing, and pressure on allied governments. Yet every lever reached only part of the machine. Pull one, and another gear spun faster somewhere else. Turkey became a central target in these plans because its poppies sat near the beginning of the chain. But poppies were not only a crime issue there. They were a farm issue, a local income issue, and soon a diplomatic issue. A farmer in Anatolia did not wake thinking about Harlem. He woke thinking about weather, seed, debt, and the price offered by whoever came with scales. The global route depended on many such practical mornings. By the late 1960s, officials pushed harder for Turkish restrictions and then bans. The policy tugged at village life in ways distant planners often miss. When one crop disappears on paper, the field still expects to feed a family. Some farmers shifted to other work, some resisted, some sold quietly before the rules changed. Supply chains dislike moral drama, but they respect price signals immediately. As pressure rose in Turkey and France, the trade began to look for other poppy zones and other routes. Southeast Asia waited in the wings with its own mountains, militias, and very interested intelligence services. History rarely leaves a market unemployed. Cold War logic traveled easily there too. In Laos, Burma, and neighboring hills, anti-communist forces needed money and transport. Planes that served one strategic purpose could accidentally be useful for another, which is a very government sort of accident. No single office sat calmly designing all of this. That would at least have been tidy. Instead, many agencies worked on narrow goals and inherited the wider mess later. One official wanted a friendly militia supplied. Another wanted a dock strike broken. Another wanted an allied president kept comfortable. Narcotics became background noise until the background had filled the whole room. The same pattern could be seen in Marseille years earlier. Anti-communist usefulness offered criminal networks a cushion. Men who delivered political convenience were granted more patience than the rest. This is one of the softer absurdities of the age. Governments declared war on drugs while subcontracting portions of the peace to men financed by them. Heinrich would have called it mixed messaging and suggested a cleaner campaign. For ordinary people, none of these grand contradictions arrived labeled as geopolitics. They arrived as supply. A packet was easier to find. Then it was cheaper. Then a neighborhood learned new routines around its presence. In New York, police, doctors, ministers, and families all groped for answers. Some still favored punishment first. Some argued for hospitals and maintenance. Some simply felt tired and hoped the next plan would be less foolish. Treatment existed, though unevenly, and often too late for those who needed steady help. Clinics had waiting lists, rules, and thin budgets. Recovery stories were quieter than arrests, so newspapers seldom lingered over them. Yet quiet work had begun. A counselor in a church basement kept cards in a shoebox. A nurse in a city clinic learned which tone of voice made frightened patients stay. A mother hid a little cash where her son would not think to search, then made soup anyway. The soup might have beans, onions, celery, and a ham bone if fortune allowed. The church coffee was always too hot and somehow weak at the same time. Folding chairs scraped the floor with a sound every city seems to own. These scenes rarely make the posters, but they matter. The drug route had been built from routine, and any answer would need routine too. Not thunder, but repetition. Meanwhile, the famous route itself began to fray under pressure. French police improved their cases against Marseille labs. International cooperation sharpened a little. Several key traffickers were arrested, replaced, or pushed elsewhere. This did not end heroin, of course. Markets are rude that way. They mourn a route for 5 minutes, and then open another. But the French connection lost its clean title role. By the early 1970s, newer sources were ready. Southwest Asia, Southeast Asia, and later other networks would take turns. The line nobody drew on a map simply bent in a new direction. Still, the French connection mattered because it showed something lasting. Once a medicine became a black market staple, organized crime to mimic and surpass the old legal trade. It learned sourcing, refining, branding, and customer retention with grim speed. Back in the Bayer archive, the dust kept settling on Heinrich's smiling claims. The amber bottles still shone softly in winter light. The mahogany shelf held its calm as if shelves were innocent, which they usually are. Outside, a century had rushed past and learned nothing quickly. Felix Hoffmann's ghost lingered there one more time. He did not speak, because what would be the use? The room smelled faintly of paper and vanished confidence. From Turkish fields to Sicilian kitchens, from Marseille docks to Harlem hallways, the substance had traveled by ordinary means. It moved with tea breaks, shipping forms, shoelaces, family meals, and men who kept good coats for meetings. That was the part nobody liked to print in large letters. History often changes through grand speeches, but just as often through errands. A better route defeated a better slogan. And so this chapter settles in the middle of the long story. The route had been drawn in practice, if never in ink. It would shift again and again, because the world was full of corners where someone could say yes. For now the harbor quieted, the cafe cups emptied, and the poppy fields waited for dawn. The canvas kit bag lies open on a barracks bunk in the wet heat of 1971. Its metal buckle is warm to the touch. Its canvas smells of soap, dust, and the faint sour note of old rain. Outside, a helicopter chops the air into patient pieces. Inside, a small fan turns and turns, as if it has signed a contract. A soldier folds 2 shirts with tired care. He rolls a pair of socks into each boot. He tucks letters from home beside a paperback with a cracked spine. There is also a smaller bundle. It is light enough to hide in a palm. It does not look important at all. That was part of the trouble. Heroin seldom arrived with drums and trumpets. It arrived as powder in paper or in neat little bags, almost shy. In South Vietnam, it could be cheap. It could be cleaner than the rough street mixtures back home. It could be sold near bases with awful convenience. The day had its own plain rhythm. Rice steamed in tins, sweat gathered under a collar. Someone traded cigarettes for instant coffee and half a comic book. Then evening came soft and tired. A radio played low. A friend knew a friend who knew where to go. By 1971, the Army had a problem it could no longer misplace under paperwork. A surprising number of American soldiers had tried heroin. Too many had kept using it. The word epidemic began to move through offices with pressed uniforms and cooled coffee. It sat on desks beside ashtrays, carbon copies, and folders stamped urgent. At first, many officials spoke in the old, firm tone. They sounded like Heinrich the marketing man, only with more medals and worse ties. Everything was under control, they said. Every new rule was entirely modern. Every problem had a form, and the form had a box. Then the numbers kept refusing to behave. President Nixon, who liked a commission almost as much as a speech, asked for a serious study. He wanted to know what would happen when these men came home. Researchers began their careful work with clipboards, interviews, and the calm misery of telephone directories. They found mothers in kitchens, veterans in small apartments, and fathers on front steps. Urine tests were added before soldiers left Vietnam. Jars appeared on tables in long, bright rooms. The process had all the warmth of a very stern school exam. A man who tested positive stayed behind for treatment. A man who tested negative boarded the plane. It was a rough gate, but it was a gate. People at home expected a wave. They imagined addiction returning in uniform, zipped into duffel bags and set down on suburban carpets. Something stranger happened instead. Many soldiers who had used heroin in Vietnam stopped after coming home. Not all of them, but many more than experts expected. The finding did not solve anything. It simply made the old meat ideas look rather rumpled. Addiction, the study suggested, was not only a substance sitting in a spoon or folded in paper. It was also a place, a habit, a circle of people, a certain long afternoon. In Vietnam, the air had one set of smells: diesel, river mud, damp canvas, mosquito spray, and fear made a dense weather around daily life. At home, there might be a front porch and a different bed. There might be a mother calling from the kitchen. There might be work, or there might not. That last part mattered more than anyone liked. The return was easier for some than for others. A changed setting could help, but it could not perform miracles. The army had stumbled into one of the first large modern lessons about addiction. It learned that a drug could travel in a pocket, but dependence needed a whole room. While the interviews were still being typed up, the supply lines behind that room kept widening. Heroin had its own geography now. It was learning mountains and airstrips. In the uplands where Burma, Laos, and Thailand met, morning mist sat along the ridges like wool. A man could walk for hours and hear only birds, sandals, and mule bells. Poppy fields opened in pale rows on steep ground. Their flowers looked gentle enough from a distance. Many things in history have looked gentle from a distance. A farmer scored the green pods with a small blade. Milky latex beaded along the cuts. By afternoon, it had browned into sticky gum. The work was slow and ordinary. A cloth was tied at the waist. A child carried water in a dented tin. Someone set rice to cook over a low fire. Opium was not yet heroin there. It was packed, dried, traded, and moved in ways that felt older than many governments. Then came the next step. Morphine base was cooked in rough sheds and hidden rooms. Kerosene tins, cloth filters, and enamel bowls became part of the process. Later, with chemicals like acetic anhydride, that morphine was refined into heroin. The smell inside such places could be sharp and vinegary, mixed with smoke and damp wood. The powder came out pale or brown, depending on skill and materials. It was packed into bags, wrapped into bundles, and loaded for travel with almost boring efficiency. Mules carried some of it along mountain paths. Trucks carried some along roads that were roads mostly by hope. Small planes carried some farther and faster. This was the Golden Triangle. It sounds grand and shiny, like a travel poster. In practice, it was mud, ledgers, cooking pots, and difficult hills. It was also a place where Cold War politics brushed against the drug trade with an awkward sleeve. Nobody liked to discuss the sleeve very much. The CIA and its local allies were focused on fighting communists in the region. Some of those allies, quite inconveniently, were close to opium traffic or deep inside it. Airstrips built for one purpose could serve another purpose by evening. A plane can be very discreet if it is small enough. In Laos, among Hmong forces and secret operations, the lines between war logistics and local trade could blur into a dusty haze. The paperwork rarely caught up. No one needs a grand plot to make history strange. Often it is enough to have several agencies, several hills, and many men insisting they are handling only their own corner. Felix Hoffman's ghost might have stood near one of those airstrips in silence. He would have watched sacks being weighed beside fuel drums with his usual widening dismay. He never said a word. That was probably wise. Heroin from the region began reaching American troops in Vietnam in larger amounts. A local trade met foreign demand with the brisk common sense of a market stall. The powder could be smoked or sniffed. Some men thought that meant less danger. Human beings do enjoy a technical distinction when it offers comfort. Near bases, sellers learned the habits of young soldiers quickly. Paydays mattered, rest days mattered, boredom mattered more than speeches. One soldier might buy noodles from a street cart at noon. He might buy a shirt from a tailor that evening. He might buy heroin before dark. This was part of the scandal for Americans at home. The crisis did not sit in some distant alley with a proper label. It had slipped into the military itself. The war seemed to have brought back more than medals and bad dreams. It had brought back a lesson about easy supply, disrupted lives, and the speed of black markets. And once a market learns a route, it does not forget it simply because a president clears his throat. Back in American cities, another set of rooms was waiting. They were brick apartments over corner stores. They were row houses with tired steps and windows patched with cardboard. In many neighborhoods, factory whistles had gone quiet. The lunch pails had stopped swinging through dawn light. Men who once worked shifts now worked the long hours of not working. A closed mill changes the whole weather of a street. The diner loses customers. The hardware store shortens its hours. The stoop gathers more afternoon bodies. In the 1970s, heroin did not create urban decline by itself. It moved into places already bruised by lost jobs, disinvestment, and plain neglect. You can feel it in small details. The bus comes less often. A storefront becomes a church, then a vacant shell, then a place with a metal gate. In the South Bronx, in parts of Philadelphia, Baltimore, Detroit, Newark, and many other cities, heroin found whole districts where hope had become expensive. It never misses a bargain. The trade nested itself in ordinary routines. A runner leaned on a lamppost. A woman watched the corner from behind lace curtains. A radio played baseball somewhere above. Glassine envelopes became tiny pieces of local design. They were stamped with brand names, stars, crowns, and strange boasts. The black market has always loved packaging. Heinrich, the marketing man, would have admired the confidence of it. He would have frowned at the lack of formal branding standards. A user knew which corner sold strong powder. Another knew which package was mostly milk sugar and disappointment. Reputation traveled faster than buses. The day was often made of errands: cashing a check, borrowing $5, waiting in line, finding a packet, trying to keep the evening quiet. The police knew the corners. The residents knew the corners. The corners knew themselves, which was perhaps the deepest problem. Heroin use in these years crossed race and class, but the heaviest public attention settled on poor urban neighborhoods. That was where cameras came most often. Television crews preferred a certain backdrop. They liked broken windows, graffiti, and men speaking with grave certainty. They liked problems that fit into one frame. What fit less easily into a frame was deindustrialization. A closed plant is not as dramatic as an arrest. It is simply heavy and patient and everywhere. Families adapted in small ways. A grandmother took in another child. A sister worked 2 jobs. A nephew slept on a sofa under an Afghan with orange squares. Someone sold loose cigarettes on the block. Someone fixed radios in a basement. Someone knew a man who could make the rent stretch for 1 more week. Into this worn daily fabric came heroin and the economies around heroin. Not just the drug itself, but the lookout, the courier, the stash apartment, the debt. For some young men, the street trade became one of the few visible ladders left. It was not a good ladder, but it was there and it paid cash. Cash matters in neighborhoods where everything else arrives late. It matters when the lights are due. It matters when the refrigerator holds only mustard and half an onion. The senator appeared on schedule. He always did. Every 15 years or so, or sooner if cameras were available. He stood at a podium with flags behind him and certainty in front of him. He promised crackdown, cleanup, and finality, which are 3 words history treats with open amusement. A war on drugs sounds bold in a speech. On a block, it often meant more police, more prison, and the same tired hallway smell. Markets adapted with annoying speed. Sellers changed corners. Suppliers changed routes. The business model remained unpleasantly agile. Meanwhile, clinics filled with people who wanted help, and people who were not sure help wanted them. The waiting rooms had metal chairs and old magazines with curling covers. Methadone became one of the new answers. It came in little cups and strict schedules. It came with forms, rules, urine tests, and the chance of steadier days. Dr. Well-Meaning arrived in this era with the same grand mustache and a crisp white coat. He spoke gently about maintenance, compliance, and modern medicine. He was not entirely wrong, which made the matter more interesting. Methadone helped many people keep work, keep housing, and keep a shape to the week. But clinics could be rigid. Hours could clash with jobs. Rules could feel like a second occupation. A person might spend half the morning proving he deserved treatment. Still, some lined up before dawn. They held paper cups of coffee and coupons folded in coat pockets. They talked softly in the cold. A woman might take the bus across town for her dose. She might stop for bread on the way home. She might make soup and try again tomorrow. Recovery did not look grand from the outside. It looked like getting up, finding socks, keeping an appointment, and paying the gas bill on time. That quiet work mattered. It always matters, even when news cameras are elsewhere. While American cities wrestled with their own long crisis, the geography of supply shifted again. Heroin is annoyingly international for something so often discussed in purely local tones. The old French connection had been squeezed in earlier years. That network, with its Marseille labs and Sicilian middlemen, had once been a kind of criminal overnight delivery. It had more dock workers and fewer tracking numbers than modern shipping. Still, it had been efficient in its way. As one route narrowed, others widened. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, a new crescent began to glow on the map. You can place yourself at a border market near Peshawar after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Dust sits on sandals and truck fenders in the same pale layer. Tea is poured into cloudy glasses. A radio crackles with news and static. Men carry sacks of flour, cooking oil, and things not listed on any honest invoice. The Soviet invasion in 1979 shattered ordinary life across Afghanistan. It also helped build the conditions for a huge new heroin economy. War uprooted farmers and sent millions into Pakistan and Iran. Refugee camps grew fast. Smuggling networks grew faster. Opium had long been part of some local economies in the region. Under pressure of war, displacement, and opportunity, production rose sharply. The Golden Crescent came to mean Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran, though Afghanistan and Pakistan soon became the central engine. Borderlands are very good at becoming central by accident. Poppies do not care about ideology. They care about soil, labor, and whether a crop can survive trouble better than wheat. For farmers facing danger, debt, and poor roads, opium could be compact value. It could be stored, it could be carried, it could be sold through many hands. In parts of Afghanistan, a trader might advance seed, cash, or food. Repayment came later in opium gum. The arrangement was both simple and binding. Refineries appeared on the Pakistani side of the border and in Afghan areas beyond firm state control. They used imported chemicals, local protection, and practical secrecy. Acetic anhydride, that same sharp chemical once hanging in Bayer's chilly laboratory air, returned here in jerry cans and hidden loads. History has a very long smell memory. The United States funneled money and weapons to Afghan resistance fighters through Pakistan's intelligence services. The goal was to bleed the Soviet Union, not to build a narcotics empire. But wars do not keep tidy books. Money, weapons, transport, and allied militias created a vast rough system where opium and heroin could flourish nearby. The CIA did not sit around a table planning a global heroin boom. History is usually messier than a good villain allows. Still, American policy lived uncomfortably close to forces that profited from the trade. Once again, anti-communist urgency shared a hallway with drug traffic and tried not to make eye contact. Local commanders taxed crops. Smugglers moved loads with other loads. Trucks crossed roads where soldiers looked for some contraband, and not always for all of it. In bazaars, the daily life around this trade remained maddeningly ordinary. Flatbread browned on a griddle. Diesel fumes mixed with cardamom tea. Boys carried spare parts through the dust. Then packets moved onward. Some traveled through Iran toward Turkey and Europe. Some moved through Karachi by sea. Some moved by air and luggage and cargo. By the 1980s, Afghan heroin was reaching more distant markets in greater volume. A field on one hillside could end up in a city 10 time zones away. No single hand controlled the whole journey. That was another lesson. The trade worked through layers of brokers, transporters, chemists, militias, police, and chance. The senator, however, preferred a single villain. Single villains fit on posters, and in campaign mailers. Supply chains do not. Back in the United States, the urban crisis deepened. Factories kept closing. Public housing aged. City budgets frayed at the corners like old towels. Heroin remained part of this worn landscape, even as crack cocaine seized much of the public imagination. Newspapers can focus on one substance while another keeps doing business. In some neighborhoods, users shifted between drugs according to price, supply, and what the day seemed able to bear. Black markets are flexible because life forces people to be flexible. A tenement apartment might hold 3 generations and one refrigerator hum. The wallpaper peeled in soft curls, the kitchen table wobbled, unless someone folded cardboard under one leg. At the corner store, canned milk stood beside cheap bread and batteries behind the counter. A boy bought a pickle in a plastic bag. A man counted coins twice. These details matter because crisis never arrives alone. It arrives among dishes in the sink, school shoes by the radiator, and bills tucked into a jar. Heroin's place in urban America cannot be separated from redlining, lost manufacturing, poor schools, and cramped housing. The drug fit into wounds made by many hands. This did not make the suffering less real. It simply made it less simple. Treatment programs expanded in some places and stalled in others. Funding came, vanished, returned, and acquired conditions like burrs on a coat. Some neighborhoods built informal systems of care before institutions bothered to notice. Grandmothers watched children. Former users talked newcomers through one more evening. Church basements served coffee in foam cups. A person trying to stop might learn every creak in the apartment floor. He might drink sweet tea at 3 in the morning. He might walk around the block until sunrise. These are not grand historical facts, but history is mostly made of them. Then another catastrophe entered the room, almost quietly at first. It did not announce itself with cavalry music. It came in fevers, weight loss, rumors, and unanswered questions. In the early years of AIDS, many Americans thought of it through one narrow set of images. The reality was much wider and much crueler in its reach. People who injected drugs were one of the groups hit hard, especially in cities where heroin use was common and sterile syringes were not. The virus followed shared equipment with terrible efficiency. The objects themselves were ordinary: a syringe wrapped in paper, a cotton filter, a bent spoon in a kitchen drawer, a bottle of water on a windowsill. Scarcity turned these objects into pathways. When clean needles were hard to get, people reused and shared what they had. Disease loves thrift when systems demand it. In many places, buying syringes was restricted or watched. Carrying them could draw police attention. Public policy managed to make caution itself look suspicious. You can sit in a clinic waiting room in 1985 and feel the silence. The floor smells of disinfectant and old winter boots. A television hangs high in one corner, with the sound low. A nurse calls names from a clipboard. A vending machine hums. Someone coughs into a folded handkerchief and stares at the tiles. Doctors were learning in real time. Some learned quickly and with humility. Others trailed behind events in the usual cloud of confidence. Dr. Well-Meaning returned with fresh pamphlets and the same immortal mustache. He now spoke about risk reduction in tones suggesting he had always believed in it. Again, he was not entirely wrong. Education helped. Methadone helped. Outreach workers helped. Bleach kits and syringe exchange would help even more. But these measures often arrived late, underfunded, or blocked by politics. The virus moved faster than committee schedules. The public health catastrophe inside the drug catastrophe was easy to miss if one only watched press conferences. Press conferences prefer clean podiums to complicated human beings. The senator held another one anyway. He talked about crime, resolve, and values. He did not talk much about clean needles. Needle exchange programs, where they appeared, often began with local stubbornness. Health workers, activists, former users, and neighbors did the dull, brave work of handing out sterile equipment and plain advice. Their tools were not glamorous: card tables, zip bags, sharps containers, coffee in a foam cup gone lukewarm before noon. A person might step up to a folding table in an alley or church lot. He might take clean syringes, condoms, and a flyer. He might also take a moment of simple respect. That respect mattered more than officials liked to admit. People returned to places where they are treated like people. AIDS changed the conversation around drug use, though not evenly and not fast enough. It forced medicine, law, and public health into the same room, where they fidgeted for years. It also made the cost of moral theater harder to ignore. A speech could not stop a virus. A slogan could not disinfect a syringe. Hospitals in hard-hit cities filled with patients carrying several burdens at once. They had addiction, poverty, infection, and often the deep fatigue of being blamed for all four. Yet even here, daily life kept its plain shape. Someone brought oranges in a plastic bag. Someone adjusted a blanket. Someone wrote a phone number on a scrap envelope. In neighborhoods with many losses, grief became part of the furniture. It sat quietly beside the lamp and the family photos. People still made dinner around it. The heroin trade for its pipe kept moving. Supply shifted with enforcement and global events. Demand rose and fell with economics, despair, treatment, and chance. By the late 1980s, the world map behind one American packet might include Afghan fields, Pakistani labs, Turkish routes, Caribbean transfers, or older city wholesalers working new sources. The line had become very long, and still at the smallest scale, it ended in the same tiny gestures: a folded bill, a closed fist, a walk up one staircase. The lesson of these decades was not neat. Vietnam had shown that setting mattered. The city crisis showed that setting could also be broken on a grand scale. The Golden Triangle and Golden Crescent showed that global politics could nourish supply without meaning to, or while pretending not to notice. Black markets adored denial almost as much as opportunity. A president could order a study. A senator could announce a war. A clinic could open on a tired avenue and hand out numbers on paper slips. All of those things mattered. None of them were enough by themselves. Slowly, very slowly, a different understanding began to gather. Addiction was not only vice, crime, weakness, or bad character in a neat little file. It was also pain, habit, chemistry, place, memory, and often the shape of a neighborhood after work had left it. That is a harder speech to write. Treatment improved in patches. Recovery networks grew. Harm reduction, though contested, proved useful wherever people were patient enough to notice evidence. The pace was halting. It had the feel of mending a worn coat by candlelight. One stitch held, another slipped. Still the work continued. If you look back across these years, the journey of diacetylmorphine seems almost absurdly wide. It reaches from mountain poppies to military barracks, from factory shadows to clinic chairs, from border bazaars to city stairwells. And somewhere behind it all, on that old mahogany shelf in Elberfeld, the amber bottles still gleam in imagination. Pale winter light falls through tall windows that no one in 1898 could see beyond. The chemical tang hangs in the cold air. The room remains tidy. The future, as usual, is standing just outside the door in muddy boots. Felix Hoffman's ghost lingers there for a moment, looking more tired than ever. Then history moves on again, carrying its small packets, its forms, its speeches, and its quiet, stubborn acts of care. Perhaps the mind lingers first on that room in Elberfeld. The pale winter light still lies across the tall factory windows. The air still carries that sharp chemical tang of acetyl anhydride in the cold. The amber bottles still stand in a neat row on the mahogany shelf. They look so tidy. They look so sure of themselves. A clerk could dust them in under a minute. A salesman could praise them for much longer. Heinrich, the marketing man, seems close by again. He is smooth as ever. His cuffs are perfect. His smile says that modern science has solved one more troublesome little problem. He would be delighted to hand out glossy pamphlets to every doctor in Europe. He would call it progress in the same warm tone that later men would call things streamlined, targeted, or evidence-informed. He is never wicked. He is simply certain. That is his gift. That is also his curse. And somewhere near the shelf stands Felix Hoffman's ghost. He says nothing. He only watches his second famous molecule begin its very long walk away from home. Then the scene changes, very gently, to a much plainer room many decades later. The grand shelf is gone. The mahogany is gone. In its place there is a counter that has seen better years. There is a plastic chair with one leg that does not fully trust the floor. There is early light through wired glass. There is a line of tired coats. There is the small dry cough of winter. There is the rustle of paper cups. This is one of the quiet rooms where methadone maintenance settled in and stayed. It never looked dramatic enough for posters. It never sounded shiny enough for a trade name. It asked for patience instead of wonder. A person comes in, a name is checked, a dose is measured, the cup is handed over. The swallow is simple. Then comes a bus ride to work, then comes grocery shopping, then comes the ordinary business of keeping a day together. It is one of the strangest turns in the whole long story. After so many loud promises, one of the better answers arrived wearing linoleum shoes and carrying a clipboard. It had rules, it had waiting lists, it had funding troubles, because of course it did. Yet it also had mornings, it had routine, it had people who learned the desk staff by name. It had the slow and almost invisible grace of not making a crisis out of every hour. The same feeling returns in those first needle exchanges. A folding table appears in a church basement or a side street van. There are brown paper bags. There are clean syringes. There are alcohol swabs and little bits of cotton. There is coffee that tastes like a noble attempt. There is someone on the other side of the table who does not ask for a speech. The whole idea feels almost humble to the point of rudeness. The world keeps asking for grand final answers. Harm reduction replies with a box of practical things and a soft voice. It says that while humans argue, hands still need clean tools. It says that life can be made safer by inches. It says that even 1 inch matters. It is not romantic. It is not grand. It is simply decent in a plain room under bad lights. And then, because history enjoys a repeated joke, in walks Dr. Well-Meaning for his final appearance. The mustache is still magnificent. Time has not managed to defeat it. His tie is tasteful. His charts are tidy. His desk now holds brochures with a new set of smiling promises. The word is pain now. The language is modern. The packaging is careful. The confidence is somehow even more polished than before. One can almost hear Heinrich clearing his throat in admiration from beyond the decades. Here again is a substance framed as manageable. Here again are doctors told that the risk has been overstated. Here again is a very neat explanation for why this time will be different. The OxyContin years drift back with their sales visits and sponsored talks. They come with little scales for rating pain. They come with phrases that sound measured and safe. They come with the old wish to believe that chemistry, branding, and good intentions can finally sit in one room without making trouble. Dr. Well-Meaning prescribes in good faith. He wants people to hurt less. That part is true. He wants to practice modern medicine. That part is true too. But the evidence moves slower than the brochures. It always does. By the time the tidy language starts to fray, the old story is already finding the old roads again. Pills become scarce. Pills become costly. Some people are cut off quickly. Some people go looking for what the street can offer. And the street, like every old trader in history, is very willing to sell a substitute. In many places that substitute arrives as Mexican black tar heroin. It is dark and sticky and stubborn. It travels north through routes built by money and need, which are two of the most faithful map makers on earth. It settles into towns, suburbs, and cities that once thought this was somebody else's problem. It moves with a quiet confidence of its own. No one prints glossy pamphlets for it. It does not need them. Then even that market begins to shift. Powders appear. Mixing changes. Fentanyl enters the supply in amounts so tiny that scales and luck both start to matter far too much. The molecule from the old bottle is no longer alone. It is crowded by stronger cousins and rougher business habits. What once came in a measured tablet or a known bag becomes uncertain. Uncertainty is a wearying thing. It makes every purchase feel like weather. It makes every rumor important. It makes people carry news street by street, like villagers discussing rain. Yet this part of the story also gave us some of the clearest acts of care. The naloxone kit appears in a pocket, in a purse, in a glove box, in the drawer beside old menus. It is small, it is light. It has none of Heinrich's theatrical flair. It offers no empire of claims. It simply waits until it is needed. In another room there is a supervised consumption site. The chairs are plain. The sink is bright. There are sharps bins and clocks, and workers who know how to speak without causing extra shame. The miracle, if that word may be used softly, is how unmagical it looks. People come in. People are greeted. People use with less risk. People leave alive. The whole arrangement can seem almost offensively sensible. It lacks the drama many politicians prefer. The senator, in one of his many rotating forms, never entirely disappears from this chapter either. Every decade produces another version of him. He arrives with cameras. He announces a final campaign. He enjoys the phrase zero tolerance in the same way some men enjoy a new fountain pen. Paperwork grows. Press releases bloom. The old machinery rattles back to life. But underneath that noise, the quieter culture keeps building. Recovery meetings gather in circles of metal chairs. Coffee steams in large urns that have served generations of confession and relief. A person says their name. Another person nods in a way that means they truly understand. Medication treatment becomes more common, though never as common as needed. Buprenorphine joins methadone. Counselors learn new words, then try to make the words useful. Families learn that progress may look like a month, then a week, then one kept appointment. Research catches up my slow degrees. Evidence-based treatment, which sounds so formal on paper, often comes down to a phone call answered kindly on a Tuesday afternoon. It comes down to a clinic that does not make a person fail 3 times before letting them in. It comes down to housing, rides, meals, sleep, and the ability to imagine next Thursday. In that way, the chapter circles back to the first shelf and quietly corrects it. The old bottle offered certainty. The later century offered punishment. The better answers turned out to be smaller and more patient. They were not clean victories. They were habits. They were cups, kits, chairs, forms, counselors, bus passes, pharmacy hours, support groups, and workers who stayed calm. They were the long opposite of a miracle. They were understanding, arriving in practical clothes, and that may be why these moments stay with you now. Not because they are grand, but because they are human-sized. The bottle on the shelf once seemed to contain a perfect answer. In the end, the more hopeful scenes were the ones where no one claimed perfection at all. By now the story has grown quiet enough to feel almost warm. The night can hold these old rooms and paper cups and amber glass for a little while longer, until they blur into the soft weight of sleep. Felix Hoffman's ghost, at last, seems to have found a chair and decided that watching in silence is work enough for 1 century. May your dreams be free of Bayer's product development pipeline. May no one ever hand you something described as completely non-addictive. May your cough remain entirely unremarkable. Thank you for listening. Keep your thoughts gentle, and good night.